The train didn't slow gracefully into Black Creek. It groaned and hissed and shuddered to a stop like something wounded, releasing a thick belch of steam that drifted low across the platform planks before dissolving into the dry October air. Evelyn Harper stepped down from the second car with a carpetbag in her left hand and a hat box balanced against her hip, and she stood for a moment on the platform looking out at the town. It wasn't what she'd imagined, but then very little in her life had been. Black Creek, Kansas sat at the edge of the open plains like something left behind by a river that had long since changed course. The main street ran straight and unpaved, flanked on either side by buildings that were mostly functional and not much else. A dry goods store, a livery, a barbershop with a crooked wooden sign, a saloon that was already doing moderate business at 3 in the afternoon. There were horses tied at posts and a dog sleeping in the shade of a water trough, and 2 women in bonnets who stopped their conversation to look at Evelyn with the particular stillness of people who had recognized something unusual and weren't yet sure what to make of it. Evelyn set her hat box down on the platform bench and opened her coat at the collar. The air was warm for autumn, and the journey from Missouri had taken 3 days and 2 uncomfortable nights in a train car that smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool. She was tired. Her back ached from the seat. Her hat needed adjusting, and she was had been aware since street. Louis, that the hem of her traveling dress had acquired a thin line of dust along the bottom that no amount of brushing had fully removed. She pulled the folded letter from her coat pocket and read it again, though she'd read it enough times by now that she could have repeated it from memory. Seeking a capable woman of practical disposition and sound character, willing to undertake frontier life. Widower, 38, with 2 children, operating a cattle ranch north of Black Creek, Kansas. Correspond with G. Cross, care of the Black Creek Post Office. She had answered that advertisement in October, and the exchange of 3 letters over 6 weeks had led her here. She was not a romantic. She had not come expecting love or tenderness or anything resembling a courtship. She had come because she was 34 years old, had spent the last 9 years as a seamstress in Jefferson City, and had watched the years accumulate without anything much changing except the gray that was threading quietly into her dark hair. She had come because a practical arrangement seemed to her at this stage more honest than waiting for something that might never arrive. She folded the letter back into her pocket and picked up her bags. The post office was easy enough to find. It shared a building with the telegraph office 2 blocks down the main street, and the man behind the counter directed her, without much warmth, to the general store, where he said the ranchers usually collected their messages. At the general store, a woman named Mrs. Aldridge confirmed that yes, she knew the Cross Ranch, and that Gideon Cross came into town most Saturdays, but that she had no idea whether he was expected today. She said it in the flat, informative way of a person giving directions to a stranger, with no particular interest in what came next. Evelyn thanked her and went outside and stood on the boardwalk with her carpetbag at her feet. She was working out whether to find somewhere to sit and wait or to make inquiries at the saloon, which she immediately dismissed, when she heard her name. "Miss Harper?" She turned. The man standing at the near corner of the general store was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. He was tall, with weathered skin the color of old saddle leather, and he wore his hat pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he'd forgotten it was there. His coat was clean but not new. He was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between assessment and uncertainty. "Yes," she said. "Are you Mr. Cross?" "I am." He came closer and stopped at a distance that was polite without being warm. He looked at her, not rudely, not with the leering appraisal of some men, but with a directness that was almost clinical. Taking stock was the phrase that came to her. He was taking stock of her. "I got your last letter Thursday," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I said I would." People say a lot of things. He glanced at her bags, then back at her face. "How long have you been in town?" "About 40 minutes." He nodded slowly. The silence stretched. She had the uncomfortable sense that whatever deliberation he was conducting had not yet resolved itself, and that she was standing in the middle of it without any say in the outcome. "She was right, Miss Harper," he said finally, and the shift in his voice was subtle, but she caught it, something that had been considering closing off. "I've been thinking, since I wrote last." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that seemed habitual rather than nervous. "The thing is, I put that advertisement out in July. And since then, things at the ranch things are different now than they were. The situation has changed somewhat." She looked at him steadily. In what way? I've been managing. He said it like a man convincing himself. The kids they're adjusting. And I've got a neighbor woman who comes twice a week to help with cooking. I don't know that I need. He stopped. I don't know that bringing a stranger into the house is the right thing. For the children. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. The dog by the water trough had woken up and was ambling across the street with no particular purpose. Are you withdrawing the offer? She asked. I think so. He said it carefully like a man expecting an argument. I'm sorry you came all this way. I'll cover your return fare. It's the least I can do. She nodded once. She did not argue, because she had learned a long time ago that arguing with a decision already made was mostly just exhausting. She said thank you, and she meant neither gratitude nor its opposite, and she picked up her carpet bag and walked back toward the general store because it was the nearest building and she needed a moment to think. Inside, Mrs. Aldridge looked up from behind the counter. Something in Evelyn's expression must have communicated the situation because the older woman's face did a brief, involuntary thing. A flash of something that was not quite sympathy, not quite curiosity, but somewhere between the two. Didn't work out? She said. It did not. Mrs. Aldridge folded her hands on the counter. He's been hard to pin down since Martha died. I'll say that much. Wouldn't read too much into it. Evelyn set her carpet bag down and worked out her situation with the same systematic focus she applied to most problems. She had $31 and some cents in her purse. Her return ticket to Jefferson City would cost her roughly $12, which she did not yet have because Gideon Cross had offered to cover it, and she had not yet collected it. Her hatbox was still on the bench at the train platform. She needed to decide in the next few minutes whether to go back and accept the return fare or the bell above the door rang. She turned, expecting it to be Gideon Cross, but it was not. It was a different man, shorter, heavy-set, with a red face and a manner that announced itself before he finished crossing the threshold. Mrs. Aldridge, he said, then stopped when he saw Evelyn. He looked her over in a way that was frankly rude. Who's this? A traveler, Mrs. Aldridge said with a flatness that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry. It did not discourage further inquiry. You're not the woman who answered the Cross advertisement? He said to Evelyn with a kind of aggressive certainty, as if he already knew and was merely confirming. I did answer it, yes, Evelyn said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Well, you're not what he described. He didn't describe me, she said. We corresponded in writing. Sure. He studied her with a satisfied expression, the way some men look when they've found something to be superior about and intend to make the most of it. I'm Tom Farley. I ranch south of town. I put out a similar advertisement last spring. Didn't take. He glanced at her left hand, bare of any ring, then at her face. I can see why Cross passed. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. I don't believe I asked for your assessment, Mr. Farley. No, he agreed pleasantly, but I gave it free of charge. He bought his tobacco and left. She stood where she was and breathed through her nose. That was the first. She went back outside with her carpet bag and walked to the platform to collect her hatbox. And on the way back down the main street, she passed a man sitting on a barrel outside the barber shop who looked at her with frank curiosity and said, without much preamble, You the woman Cross sent away? News traveled fast in small towns. She'd known this. She'd grown up in a small town. I arrived today, yes, she said. Where are you headed now? I'm working that out. He stood up. He was younger than she'd initially assessed, mid-30s perhaps, with a decent face and hands that had known work. I'm Walt Briggs, he said. I've got a farm about 6 miles east. No kids, just me and a hired man. He said it with the directness of someone who had been thinking for a while about saying it and had decided this was as good a moment as any. I heard about the Cross situation. I'd be willing to, if you're looking for a place, I mean. If you're in a bind. She looked at him carefully. She recognized the offer for what it was. A mix of opportunism and genuine awkwardness. A man who had been lonely long enough to act on impulse. She was not opposed to the offer on principle, but there was something in the way he looked at her, a calculating quality beneath the directness that made her slow. What would you be expecting? She asked plainly. A wife, he said. Someone who could manage the house, cook, maybe help with records when harvest comes. And beyond the house? He blinked. I'm sorry? In terms of what would the arrangement look like? What share of decision-making would be mine? What would happen to my wages from my previous work? She kept her voice level and genuinely curious, because she was. Walt Briggs's expression shifted, not unkindly, exactly, but with a recalibration, like a man who had thought the negotiation would go one way and was adjusting to the discovery that it was going another. I hadn't thought that far, he admitted. I see. She let the silence do its work for a moment. Thank you, Mr. Briggs. I'll keep your offer in mind. She walked on. He didn't call after her. That was the second. She found a bench on the shaded side of the street and sat down and put her hat box beside her and her carpet bag at her feet, and looked at the main street of Black Creek with the particular clarity that comes when a person has run out of immediate options and must simply think. $31 and some cents, $12 for the return fare, $19 left, give or take. A room at the boarding house, if there was one, would cost her perhaps $2 a week. She could find seamstress work in any town, but it took time to establish clients, and it was slow money, and she was tired of slow money in cold rooms. She was tired of managing, just managing, which was all she'd done since she was 25, and her mother died, and her father followed the next winter, and the house had to be sold to pay what was owed. She was not angry, exactly. She had been angry at various points, but sustained anger was expensive, and she'd learned to spend her energy elsewhere. She was calculating. The shadow fell across her without warning. Miss Harper, she looked up. This was the third man of the afternoon, though she didn't know that yet. He was older than the others, perhaps 50, with a good suit that suggested money and the particular kind of authority that money tends to buy in frontier towns. He had a large silver watch chain and a neat mustache and eyes that were small and blue and missed very little. I'm Harvey Doone, he said. I own the Doone Cattle Company, north and west of here. He said it the way some men name their horses, with genuine fondness. I know who you are. Everybody does by now. He smiled slightly. Small town. So I've noticed, she said. He sat down beside her on the bench, uninvited, but with the ease of a man who is rarely uninvited. I'll be direct, he said. I've been looking for a housekeeper, someone capable who could manage the household properly. I've got a large house and no patience for disorder. I'd pay well, better than most. She waited. But I need to know that whoever I hire can represent my household. When I have business associates through, when I'm entertaining, presentation matters. He let the words settle for a moment. And I have to be honest with you. I'm looking for someone who, the women I've had before were perhaps better suited to the role. In terms of, he gestured vaguely, the kind of gesture that meant appearance and expected to be understood. You're telling me I don't look the part, she said. I'm being honest. You are, she agreed, though honesty and kindness aren't always the same thing. He looked at her with a kind of approval that she immediately distrusted. The approval of a man who likes to see others take criticism well, because it confirms his right to give it. Sharp, he said. I like that. But for this particular position, I need someone who... Thank you, Mr. Doone, she said. I appreciate the directness. He held her gaze for a moment, then stood, straightened his coat, and walked away with the solid, unhurried gait of a man who was accustomed to leaving rooms rather than being left in them. She watched him go. 3 men in one afternoon, she thought. That was almost impressive. The sun had moved a good deal further west, and the air was cooling with the sudden efficiency of the plains, when Evelyn became aware that she had an audience. It had assembled gradually, in the way that audiences do in small towns, not deliberately, but through the organic accumulation of people who had heard something interesting and found reasons to be nearby. There were a handful of men outside the saloon who had been watching the whole proceeding with the easy interest of men who had nothing better to do at 4 p.m. There were 2 women across the street who were discussing something in low voices and looking at her periodically. There was a boy sitting on the fence beside the livery who had apparently been there the entire time, watching with the frank intensity of children who haven't yet learned to pretend otherwise. One of the men outside the saloon said something she didn't catch, and the others laughed. She knew what it was about. She wasn't young, and she wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. She was thin in the wrong places, and her nose was too strong for her face, and she'd always had the kind of features that read as intelligent rather than pretty, which in her experience was far less useful in most social situations. She had understood for a long time how she was perceived. She had made her peace with it in the methodical way she made her peace with most things, by deciding it was information, not a verdict, and information could be worked with. But sitting on this bench in Black Creek with the laughter drifting over from the saloon, 3 rejections still fresh in the afternoon air, she felt the weight of it more than usual. It pressed down on her with a specific gravity, the particular heaviness of being assessed and found wanting in public, in front of strangers, with nowhere to go. She did not cry. She was not the type, or rather, she had trained herself out of the type over years of practice. But she sat very still for a long moment with her hands in her lap and let herself feel it fully, because she'd also learned that pretending something didn't hurt just meant came back later, at worse times, in worse ways. Then she picked up her carpet bag, set her hat box on top of it, and stood up. She didn't have a destination yet. That was fine. She'd figure one out. She walked down the main street of Black Creek with her 2 bags and her head level, not fast and not slow, the way she walked everywhere, like a woman who was going somewhere even when she wasn't sure where that was. She'd learned that particular walk from her mother, who had learned it from hers, and it had carried both of them through considerable difficulty without making them look like they needed rescuing. The boarding house, it turned out, was at the far end of the main street, and it was run by a woman named Hilda Crane, who was somewhere north of 60 and managed the establishment with brisk efficiency and no particular sentimentality. She had a room available at $2 a week, and she charged an extra 50 cents for meals, and she did not ask questions about Evelyn's situation. This was, Evelyn thought, the most generous thing anyone had offered her since she'd stepped off the train. She paid for 1 week in advance, which left her $27 and some cents, and she carried her bags up to a small room on the second floor with a window that looked out at the plains to the north. The room had a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with a chair, and a hook on the wall for her coat. There was a braided rug on the floor that had once been several colors and had arrived through long use at a general brownish gray. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. North of town, somewhere out on those plains, there was a ranch called Cross Ridge, with a man who decided he didn't need her and 2 children who didn't know she existed. There were also debts on that ranch, she suspected. Men who advertised for wives and then withdrew the offer at the last moment were usually carrying some burden that had made them cautious, and caution of that particular flavor usually had a financial root. She'd learned to read between the lines of correspondence over the years, and Gideon Cross's letters, while not desperate, had been the letters of a man who was tightly stretched. That wasn't her problem. He'd made that clear. She pulled off her boots and set them beside the door and lay down on the narrow bed with her coat still on, and looked at the ceiling and ran through her options with the methodical attention she'd trained herself to apply to problems. She could take the return fare tomorrow and go back to Jefferson City, which was safe and certain and exactly what her life had already been for 9 years. She could try to establish herself as a seamstress in Black Creek, which would take months to build into anything viable and would mean watching her $27 disappear in the meantime. She could look for work as a housekeeper, so not with Dune, but with someone, which would at least be immediate income. Or she could wait and see whether the situation resolved itself in some way she couldn't currently anticipate. She had, over the course of her life, learned that sometimes situations resolved themselves and sometimes they didn't, and that the trick was in knowing which kind you were dealing with. She wasn't sure yet what kind this was. She fell asleep in her coat before she finished deciding. The next morning, she came downstairs at 7 to find Hilda Crane in the kitchen making oatmeal with the focused dedication of someone performing a duty rather than a pleasure, and 3 other boarders at the table, 2 male itinerant workers who acknowledged her with nods, and a thin woman of perhaps 40 who introduced herself as Marjorie and who seemed to be making the boarding house a semi-permanent situation. Evelyn ate her oatmeal and drank her coffee and listened to the table conversation, which was mostly about the weather and the price of cattle and something that had happened at the Farley Ranch 2 months ago that Marjorie seemed to know a great deal about. She said very little herself because she was still assessing. After breakfast, she walked back to the main street and stopped first at the general store. Mrs. Aldridge looked up from her ledger. She had the kind of face that defaulted to neutral but wasn't actually unfriendly. Evelyn had met women like this and generally found them more reliable than the women who were warm immediately. "Need something?" Mrs. Aldridge said. "I need to find work," Evelyn said. "Seamstress work, primarily. Do you know if there's any demand in town?" Mrs. Aldridge considered. "There's a woman named Patterson who does most of the mending and alterations. She's got more than she can manage, honestly. Her eyesight's going." She looked at Evelyn with a directness that was, in its way, respectful. "You could talk to her." "Thank you. Where would I find her?" "Behind the church, pale blue house with the geraniums." She found the pale blue house, and she found Mrs. Patterson, who was indeed a woman whose eyesight was going, She held Evelyn's letter of reference at arm's length and squinted at it with determined effort. She was 60 or so, small and sharp-featured, with the quick hands of someone who had been sewing all their life. "Can you do fine work?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Yes." "What about pattern drafting? I've got 3 women who need dresses made from scratch, and I've been putting them off for 2 months." "I can draft patterns." Mrs. Patterson held her gaze for a moment, then made a sound that was about as close to satisfied as she apparently got. "Come back this afternoon and I'll show you what needs doing. I can't pay much." "We'll discuss it," Evelyn said. She came back at 2 and spent 3 hours in Mrs. Patterson's front room with pins and measuring tape and a bolt of calico that needed to become a dress for the mayor's wife by Friday. By the time she left, they had agreed on a rate that was modest but better than nothing, and Mrs. Patterson had told her without much ceremony that she was competent. It was the most genuinely positive thing anyone had said to her in 2 days, and Evelyn felt it settle into her with a warmth that was slightly embarrassing in its intensity. She was competent. She had always been competent, but sometimes it needed someone else to say it. She walked back to the boarding house through the cooling afternoon and stopped at the edge of the main street and looked north, out past the end of town to where the plains stretched flat and enormous and golden in the late light. Somewhere out there was Cross Ridge Ranch, and a man she had agreed to marry and then been unmade from marrying in the space of a single afternoon conversation. She stood there for a while, not planning anything, not deciding anything, just looking. Gideon Cross came into town on Saturday morning, as Mrs. Aldridge had said he usually did. Evelyn didn't plan to encounter him. She was at Mrs. Patterson's by 8 and didn't finish until past noon, and she walked back to the boarding house by the alley behind the main street. So it was almost accidental that she passed the hardware store at the exact moment he was coming out of it, with a coil of fence wire slung over one shoulder and a boy trailing behind him. She recognized him from the hat. The hat pushed back, still slightly forgotten looking. He stopped when he saw her. The boy. She guessed he was about 9, with Gideon's same dark eyes and his mother's width across the cheekbones, if she was reading the family resemblance correctly, looked between them with the alert, watchful expression of a child who has learned that adult encounters often contain information. "Miss Harper," Gideon said. His voice was neutral in a way that could have been anything. "Mr. Cross," she said. She made to keep walking. She didn't have anything to say to him. Nothing useful, anyway. And standing in the middle of the street having an awkward exchange was not on her list of things to do with a Saturday afternoon. "You're still in town," he said. "I am. I thought you'd have taken the train back by now." "I'm working," she said. "Seamstress work with Mrs. Patterson." Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't quite identify it. "Good," he said, and the word came out with a roughness that suggested he meant it more than he'd intended to show. "This is Caleb," he added, gesturing at the boy. The boy looked at her with eyes that were older than his face. "You're the woman from the advertisement," he said. "I am," she said. "How do you do?" "Fine," he said. Then, "Papa said he changed his mind." "He did," she agreed. "Why?" "Caleb." Gideon's voice was a warning, but the boy kept looking at her with those direct, assessing eyes. "Were you sad?" She considered the question. She liked that he'd asked it, that he was the kind of child who asked what other children thought to avoid. "A little," she said. "Mostly I was practical about it." "What does that mean?" "It means I found other things to do." He thought about this. "Okay," he said, with the simple acceptance of a child who has received a satisfactory answer. Gideon was watching her with an expression that had developed something in it she hadn't seen before, a specific kind of difficulty. The look of a man struggling with something that hasn't resolved yet. He started. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said. She said it without sharpness, because she meant it. "You made a decision. I adapted. That's the end of it." She nodded to him and then to the boy and walked on. She made it 3/4 of the way down the block before she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Harper." She turned. He was still standing in front of the hardware store with the fence wire over his shoulder and the boy beside him. And he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain. Not in the calculating, withdrawing way of their first conversation, but in the way of a man who has been running a calculation in his head for several days and has arrived at an answer he hadn't expected. "Could I buy you a cup of coffee?" he said. "At the diner, the 3 of us." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the boy who was watching her with steady curiosity. "I suppose so," she said. The diner was run by a woman named Lou, who kept 3 tables and a counter, and an attitude of cheerful impatience that seemed to speed the service considerably. She brought coffee for the adults and milk for the boy without being asked, which suggested she knew them, and she glanced at Evelyn once with the frank interest of someone who has heard a piece of the story and wants to see how it continues. Gideon wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and didn't drink it immediately. Caleb drank his milk with systematic concentration. "I was hasty," Gideon said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." He looked up. "I've been running Cross Ridge alone for 2 years, since my wife died, and I've been telling myself it's manageable. And it is. We're managing." He said the word with a weight that suggested managing was the least satisfying thing in the world. "But Clara, my daughter, she's been sick off and on all summer, and the fence on the north pasture needs a week of work. And I've got a mortgage payment coming in January that I don't have covered." He stopped himself. "I'm telling you more than I meant to." "It's all right," she said. "I'm not going to use it against you." He looked at her as if he was deciding whether that was true, and then seemed to decide that it was, though not because she'd said it. "I reacted badly on Thursday," he said. "You came all this way, and I told you I'd changed my mind without giving you more than 5 minutes to—" He made a short, frustrated motion with one hand. "I didn't behave well." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." He blinked. She thought perhaps he'd expected something more forgiving. "But I understand it," she said. "I'm a stranger. You're responsible for 2 children. Being cautious about strangers when you're responsible for children it's not wrong. It's just how it went." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very direct," he said. "I found it saves time." Caleb had finished his milk and was now listening openly without any pretense of doing otherwise. He had, Evelyn thought, his father's quality of directness, but without whatever guarding mechanism Gideon had developed over the years to keep it in check. "My daughter's name is Clara," Caleb said. "She's 7. She's got a temper." "That seems like useful information," Evelyn said. "She didn't want you to come," he added. "She said she didn't need a new mother." "Caleb," Gideon said. "She said I should say that to you," Caleb said, with the absolute confidence of a child faithfully executing a commission. "She said she wanted you to know before you came so you didn't feel surprised later." Evelyn set her coffee down. That's actually considerate of her," she said. Caleb nodded. "I told her that." Gideon had the look of a man sitting in a conversation that had taken a direction he hadn't anticipated. He rubbed one hand over his jaw, and the gesture made her notice that he was tired in a deep, structural way. Not from a few poor nights, but from something more sustained. Years, probably. "Would you be willing to come out to the ranch?" he said. Not to decide anything, just to see it. To see what you'd be coming into. Clara needs to meet you. I think she should meet you before any decision gets made." "I thought the decision was already made," she said. "I'm reconsidering." "I see." She drank her coffee. It was good coffee, which she appreciated. "And if I come out and look at the ranch and meet Clara and decide it's not what I'm looking for, then I cover your return fare and we part without any hard feelings. And if I decide it might be workable?" He met her eyes. "Then we talk about what a workable arrangement looks like." She turned her cup in her hands. Outside the diner window, the main street of Black Creek went about its Saturday business. A wagon passing, 2 men talking outside the land office, a woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window. She had spent 34 years building a life in small increments, and then watching it not add up to much. And she was tired of increments, and she was tired of safe, and she was, underneath the calculation and the practicality, simply tired of being alone in rooms. "All right," she said. "I'll come out." Caleb drank the last of his milk and set the glass down with a sense of completion. "Good," he said. "I'll tell Clara." "What?" She went out to Cross Ridge the following Thursday in Gideon's wagon, with her carpet bag and her hat box and the unfinished dress for the mayor's wife that she was taking with her because Mrs. Patterson needed it by Friday, and she worked on it during the drive, her needle moving through the calico while the planes rolled past on either side of the road, and Gideon sat at the reins beside her without speaking much. He spoke when there was something to say, which she appreciated. A lot of men filled silence with their own voices and called it conversation. "Clara's going to be she might be difficult," he said, about 2 miles out of town. "I'll manage. She doesn't trust easily. That's understandable. She's been through a lot." I know. She kept her needle moving. So have most people. He glanced at her sideways. You're not going to tell me it's fine and you're sure she'll warm up. I don't know if she'll warm up, Evelyn said. She might not. I'm not going to promise you something I can't guarantee. He looked at the road again. After a moment, he said, Martha used to say that pretending things were fine when they weren't was just postponing the problem. She sounds like she was sensible. She was. The silence settled back between them, easier now, and they drove the remaining 3 miles to Cross Ridge with the plains stretched out in every direction and the sky above them the particular blue of late October in Kansas that had a depth to it, an almost mineral clarity that Evelyn had not seen anywhere else. The ranch appeared over a low rise, but not suddenly, but gradually, the way things revealed themselves on the plains. A main house in weathered timber, 2 stories with a broad porch. A barn in better repair than the house. Corrals, empty now in the late morning. A stand of cottonwoods along what must be a creek bed, their leaves going gold. Fences in various states, some tight and new, others showing the loose sag of deferred maintenance. A year or more of deferred maintenance, she would have said. On the porch, in a straight-back chair that was too big for her, sat Clara Cross. She was 7 years old, and she looked like an argument. Small and sharp-featured and dark-eyed, she watched the approaching wagon with an expression of prepared resistance that Evelyn recognized as the expression of someone who has already decided how this is going to go and is waiting for events to confirm the decision. Gideon stopped the wagon at the porch and got down and turned to help Evelyn. But she had already climbed down on her own side and was standing with her carpet bag, looking at the ranch the way she'd looked at the main street of Black Creek 3 days ago, with the steady assessment of someone who is taking in information. Evelyn Harper, she said to Clara, who had not moved from the chair. How do you do? You can't have my mother's room, Clara said. Clara, Gideon said. I'm just telling her, Clara said. I didn't ask for your mother's room, Evelyn said. I don't know yet which rooms there are. Can I have a look at the house? Clara blinked. The prepared resistance recalibrated slightly. She'd expected argument or reassurance or possibly discomfort and had received instead a simple practical request. I suppose, she said. Evelyn went up the porch steps and through the door that Clara held open, not warmly, but not without a kind of grudging curiosity, and she stood in the main room of Cross Ridge Ranch and looked at what a life in progress looked like. What a man and 2 children and 2 years of grief and work and managed difficulty looked like when they lived inside 4 walls together. It looked like a place that had been held together by will rather than ease, a place with things still to be done, and space for a person who knew how to do things. A place that was not perfect or easy or anywhere close to what she might have imagined if she'd been the imagining type. It looked, she thought, like somewhere she might actually be useful. She set her carpet bag down and took off her hat, and behind her the door swung shut against the October wind, and the ranch settled around her like a question not quite finished being asked. The inside of Cross Ridge Ranch was the kind of place that told you everything about the people living in it, if you knew how to look. Evelyn knew how to look. The main room ran the length of the front of the house. A long table with mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace with ash still in it from the night before, shelves of practical things arranged without particular order, a coffee pot on the iron stove, boots by the door, 3 pairs in descending size, a hat on a hook that probably had not moved since a woman's hands last put it there. The air smelled of wood smoke and something underneath it, a faint, particular staleness that came when a house had been maintained but not truly managed for a long time. The difference between a place being kept alive and a place being lived in. She did not say any of this. She walked through the room slowly, looking at what needed doing and what had been done and what had been let go. And she did not offer opinions because she had not been asked for them. Clara followed 2 steps behind her, a silent, watchful presence that Evelyn was careful not to acknowledge too directly. Direct acknowledgement of a suspicious child, in her experience, tended to produce the same result as looking too quickly at a feral cat, an immediate retreat that took longer to recover from than if you'd left the thing alone in the first place. The kitchen's through there, Clara said, when Evelyn paused at a doorway. Thank you. The kitchen was better than the main room, which told her Gideon was prioritizing the practical over the presentable, which was both sensible and not something she'd criticize. The floor needed scrubbing, the shelves needed organizing. The window above the wash basin had a crack in the lower pane that had been patched with a strip of oilcloth. She looked at all of it and said nothing. My mother's bedroom is the one at the top of the stairs, Clara said. She said it not as a warning this time, but as information. The same steady delivery of facts that Caleb had offered in the diner, though with a different texture. Caleb's facts had come from openness. Clara's came from somewhere more defended. "I heard you," Evelyn said. "I told you I'm not asking for your mother's room. You might change your mind later. People do. Where would you put me if you were deciding?" Clara seemed slightly surprised by the question. She thought about it with her arms crossed, standing in the kitchen doorway. "The room at the end of the hall," she said finally. "It's the smallest, but it has 2 windows." "That sounds fine." "It's dusty." "Dust cleans." Clara looked at her for a moment. The resistance was still there, but it had acquired a small, uncertain edge. "You're not what I thought," she said. "What did you think? Someone softer." She said it with a slight frown, as if softness was something she'd been preparing to manage and its absence was unexpected. The kind of person who says everything is going to be wonderful. "Nothing is wonderful automatically," Evelyn said. "Things get better or they don't, depending on whether people work at them." Clara stared at her. Then she uncrossed her arms, shifted her weight, and walked back toward the main room without another word. Evelyn followed and found Gideon at the table with his hat off, looking at a piece of paper he'd pulled from a drawer. He looked up when she came in. "I've been thinking," he said. "About?" He put the paper down, face up. She could see columns of figures without being able to read the amounts from across the room. "About being honest with you, before anything gets decided." He pulled out the chair across from his and nodded at it. Not quite an invitation and not quite a command. She sat. He turned the paper toward her. It was a ledger page, handwritten, with expenses on one side and income on the other, and even at a glance the imbalance was clear. She looked at it carefully and did not pretend she wasn't looking. "Cattle prices dropped last spring," he said. "I'd borrowed against an expected price and the market went the other way. I've got a mortgage payment in January." He tapped a figure at the bottom. "That one. And I've got enough in the bank to cover about half of it." She looked at the figure. It was not small. "The ranch itself is worth more than the debt," he said. I'm not about to lose it. But the margins are tight enough that one bad winter, or one more drop in cattle prices, or if one of the children gets seriously sick and I have to pay a doctor." He stopped. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me." "I don't feel sorry for you," she said. He blinked. "I feel like you're giving me information I need in order to make a decision," she said. "That's appropriate. I appreciate it." She looked at the ledger again. "What's your north pasture producing right now?" He seemed slightly thrown by the question's directness. "Grass is thin up there. I've been meaning to rotate the herd, but the fence needs repair first, and I haven't had time to—" "Who does your fence work?" "I do. When I can. I've got one hired man, Tom Beal. He's good, but he's one person." She was quiet for a moment, turning things over. "What did your wife do?" "For the ranch." He was quiet for a moment too, but not in an evasive way. In the way of a man choosing accuracy over convenience. "She kept the accounts," he said. "Better than I do, and she managed the household so that I could focus on the cattle. And she was the person the neighbors talked to. If we needed something from someone, or if there was a problem with a contract, she handled the conversation." A pause. "I haven't replaced any of that." "I can see that," she said, not unkindly. From the doorway to the back of the house, Clara appeared with 2 cups of coffee that she set on the table with more care than was strictly necessary, clearly having listened to all of the preceding conversation. She sat down at the end of the table without being invited and put her chin in her hand. "You're talking about money," she said. "Clara," Gideon said. "I know about the January payment," Clara said. "I heard you and Mr. Beal talking about it in October." She said it without apology, the way a child states a fact she's been carrying for a while and is relieved to put down somewhere. She looked at Evelyn. "If you married Papa, would you help fix it?" "I can keep accounts," Evelyn said, "and I can look at where money is going and where it might be saved or made better. I can't make money appear that isn't there." "But you could help, probably." Clara nodded once, slowly, like a person entering a figure into their own internal ledger. Then she picked up her coffee cup. It was actual coffee, which struck Evelyn as a strange thing to give a 7-year-old, but she kept the observation to herself, and drank from it with a composure that was frankly a little unnerving. Gideon was watching Evelyn with an expression that was still difficult to fully read. "I want to be clear about what I'm offering," he said. I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't. It's a practical arrangement. I need someone who can run the household and help with the accounts and be here for the children when I'm working, and you need a stable situation. He paused. That's what it is. I understand, she said. In time, if the arrangement works. He stopped, seeming to decide the future was too uncertain to make promises about. I don't know what it might become. I'm not going to tell you. That's honest. Martha would have wanted the children to have. He stopped again. This one was different. Something in his face shifted with the particular involuntary quality of an emotion that arrived uninvited. He looked down at the ledger and back up. I'm not replacing her, he said, and it came out rougher than he'd intended. I want you to know I understand that. Whatever this is, it's not that. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse shifted in the corral and a crow went over, making its flat, authoritative sound. Good, Evelyn said, because I'm not trying to replace her. I don't know anything about her except that she seems to have been capable and that her children have her eyes. I'm not interested in being anyone but myself. Gideon looked at her. Something in him seemed to settle. Not relax exactly, but stop bracing. All right, he said. Do you want to see the rest of the place? Tom Beale was in the barn when they came through, mending tack with the patient efficiency of a man who has done the same job many times and has found his rhythm with it. He was perhaps 55, with a face so weathered it had gone beyond age into something geological, and hands that were disproportionately large and capable-looking. He looked up when they came in and touched the brim of his hat at Evelyn without getting up. Miss Harper, Gideon said. Tom Beale. He knows this ranch better than I do. That's probably true, Tom said, without either pride or particular humility. You the woman from the advertisement? I am, she said. He looked at her the way he'd probably looked at many things over the years. Horses, fence lines, weather, with a flat, honest assessment that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming. Can you cook? He said. Yes. Properly? Not just boiling things? Properly, she said. Good. Gideon can boil things. That's about the range of it. He went back to his mending. North fence is going to need attention before the first hard freeze, he said to Gideon without looking up. I said it in September. I know you said it in September. I'm saying it again in case it got lost. It didn't get lost. I just need another pair of hands, Tom said. I know. He glanced briefly at Evelyn. You any use with a fence? I've never repaired one, she said. But I can learn. Tom made a sound that was non-committal but not dismissive and went back to his stitching. She spent the rest of the afternoon walking the ranch with Gideon, the north pasture that needed rotation, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary and was lower than it should be this time of year, the outbuildings that were in various states of need. He talked about the land the way people talk about something they love without quite being able to say so directly, through specifics, through problems, through the gaps between what it was and what it could be. She listened, asked questions, and said less than she thought. By the time they drove back toward the ranch house in the early dark, Caleb had appeared from somewhere and was walking alongside the wagon, eating a biscuit with calm efficiency. Clara was on the porch with a lamp. She put the lamp on, Caleb said. I can see that, Gideon said. She does it when it gets dark. She's been doing it since... He stopped. For a while. Evelyn understood without being told. Since Martha. Since the darkness became something that needed marking. They ate supper at the long table, salt pork and potatoes, that Gideon cooked with the competent but joyless technique of a man who prepares food as fuel rather than pleasure. The biscuits were Caleb's, but he'd made them himself, he explained, from a recipe he'd memorized because his mother had made them every Thursday, and he thought someone should continue. They were slightly lopsided and a little too dense, but they were not bad, and Evelyn told him so honestly, which made him look down at his plate with the particular satisfaction of a child receiving accurate feedback rather than performance. Clara ate and said little, but she was watching Evelyn with the covert assessment of someone who is gathering data and hasn't yet decided what to do with it. After supper, Gideon asked her directly, Will you stay? They were alone at the table. Tom had gone to the bunkhouse. The children had gone upstairs, and the lamp was burning low between them. She looked at him. He looked tired in the same sustained, structural way she'd noticed in town, but there was something else in it now that she hadn't seen before, something that might have been hope, though in him it wore a very cautious expression. I'll try it, she said. For 3 months. If it's working for both of us by then, we talk about making it formal. That's fair. I want access to the full accounts. All of them. I can't help if I'm working from partial information. Done. And I'll need to go back to town twice a week for Mrs. Patterson. I gave her my word. He nodded. Tom can take you. I can take myself, she said. If you'll trust me with a horse. Something in the corner of his mouth shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The gray mare. Her name's Bess. She's steady. Good. She spent that night in the dusty room at the end of the hall that Clara had designated, on a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt that smelled of cedar and age, and she lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch, the horse shifting in the corral, the wind coming off the plains and working at the corner of the roof, the distant settling sounds of a large old house. It was not the boarding house. It was not Jefferson City. It was not anything she had planned. She slept better than she had in weeks. The first 2 weeks were, in the simplest terms, an education in how much had been let go. She didn't approach it as a criticism. She approached it the way she approached the ledger, as information. The pantry shelves had gaps where staples should have been, not from poverty, but from no one keeping track of what was running low. The household accounts, which Gideon kept in a second ledger he pulled out from under a stack of ranch records, were maintained well enough in terms of entries but had no organization, no sense of patterns, of what was being spent where, of where things could be tightened. She worked on it quietly and without announcement. She started with the pantry because that was immediate and concrete and showed results fast, which was useful for morale. She made a list of what was needed and gave it to Gideon without comment, and he took it to town without comment. And when he came back with everything on it, plus some things she hadn't asked for but had apparently thought of himself, she revised slightly upward her assessment of his practical intelligence. The accounts she worked on in the evenings, at the kitchen table after supper, with a lamp and her reading glasses, and a cup of tea that she'd brought from her carpet bag, because she'd learned long ago that her own tea in someone else's house was one of the small anchors that kept a person sane. Clara watched her do this from across the table, ostensibly working on her letters, actually reading over the tops of her paper every few minutes with unconcealed attention. "What are you doing?" Clara asked one evening. "Trying to figure out where your father's money is going every month." "Why?" "Because if I know where it's going, I can see if it's going somewhere it shouldn't." "Is it?" "Probably some of it," Evelyn said. "Most households have at least one or two things they're paying more for than they need to. The trick is finding them." Clara came around the table and stood beside her and looked at the ledger. She was close enough that Evelyn could smell the wood smoke in her hair. "That column," Clara said, pointing. "What's that one?" "Feed costs. For the cattle." "It's big." "It is. I need to understand whether it's big because the herd is large, or because the feed is priced wrong, or because there's a better option." She wrote a note in the margin. "Do you know where your father buys the feed?" "Harmon's," Clara said. "In town. He's always used Harmon's." "Does he compare prices with anyone else?" Clara frowned. "I don't think so." "That might be a place to look then." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother used to do the accounts." "I know. She was fast at it. She could add columns in her head." "That's a real skill," Evelyn said. "Can you do it?" "Not as fast. I use paper." She showed Clara the margin notes. "I write everything down in steps. It's slower, but I make fewer errors." Clara looked at the notes for a moment, then went back to her side of the table and resumed her letters. But after that evening, she tended to sit closer when Evelyn worked on the accounts, and she stopped pretending she wasn't watching. Caleb was easier in most respects, though easier didn't mean simple. He helped without being asked, which was both useful and occasionally inconvenient because he helped with everything, regardless of whether his involvement was wanted or appropriate. He appeared at her elbow while she was patching the kitchen window with proper glass that she'd bought from the hardware store, and handed her tools she didn't need with the steady helpfulness of a child who has decided to be useful and is committed to it. "You don't have to help," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." "All right." "My mother said that you could tell what someone was worth by whether they helped without being asked." She kept her attention on the window frame. "She sounds like she was right." "She usually was." He handed her the putty knife before she reached for it. "Are you going to marry Papa?" "I don't know yet," she said. "We're seeing if the arrangement works." "I think it will," he said. "Why?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. "Because you're not pretending," he said. "The women Papa's neighbor suggested last summer, they came out twice. They were both nice, but they kept saying everything was fine when it wasn't, and that the ranch was lovely when you could tell they didn't really think so. He handed her a rag. You don't do that. No, she agreed. I don't. Clara thinks you're hiding something, he said. Clara's cautious, she said. That's not a flaw. It's sensible. She cried last week, he said, about Mama. She doesn't want you to know that. Evelyn kept working. Thank you for telling me, she said. I won't mention it to her. I know, he said simply. The neighbors were another matter. The first was a woman named Ruth Holt, who ranched 3 miles east with her husband Boyd, and who appeared at the Cross Ridge Gate on Evelyn's 5th day there with a covered dish and the brisk efficiency of someone performing a social obligation they'd assigned themselves. She was 50-ish, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been handsome once, and had not exactly stopped being handsome, but had been thoroughly weathered by the practical concerns of frontier life. She looked at Evelyn the way Evelyn had been looked at most of her life, with the thorough, quickly concealed assessment of a woman calculating where another woman stands in the social landscape of a small community. Evelyn was used to it and did not take it personally. You're the one from the advertisement, Ruth said, accepting the coffee Evelyn offered and sitting at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who had sat there many times before. I am, Evelyn said. Heard you've been cleaning the place out. Organizing, Evelyn said. It was already clean enough. Ruth looked around the kitchen with an expression that managed to be both neutral and communicative. Martha kept it differently, she said. I imagine she had her own way, Evelyn said. I have mine. Ruth drank her coffee. She wasn't being hostile exactly. She was doing something more complicated than hostility, something that contained genuine wariness and a kind of loyalty to the person who used to occupy this space, which Evelyn respected even while finding it slightly exhausting. Gideon's had a hard 2 years, Ruth said. I can see that, Evelyn said. The children need stability. They do. Clara especially. She took it hard. Ruth set her cup down. I just want to say that plainly. She took it very hard, and if you're not going to stay, it would be better to know that now than later. Evelyn looked at her steadily. I said 3 months to see if the arrangement works. I meant it. I'm not here because I had nowhere better to be. Ruth held her gaze for a moment, then picked up her cup again. Good, she said, with a flatness that might have been acceptance or might have been something reserved for later. That's good. She stayed an hour and talked about the territory. The fever that had gone through some of the southern ranches in August, the drop in cattle prices, a dispute over water rights between 2 ranchers to the north that had apparently been simmering for 3 years. She talked about these things with the engaged authority of someone who paid close attention to her world, and Evelyn listened, because it was useful information and because she'd found that people who talked freely when they felt listened to often told you more than they intended to. As Ruth was putting on her coat to leave, she paused in the doorway and looked back at Evelyn with something that was slightly different from what her face had been doing before. Less assessment, more plain honesty. I'll tell you something, she said. The men in town who passed you over, I heard about it. Everybody did. Tom Farley's a fool and Harvey Doone cares more about his silverware than his household. And Walt Briggs is so cautious he'll wait himself into a lonely old age. She pulled her gloves on. I just thought you should know someone said it. She left before Evelyn could decide what to say. The accounts came together slowly, the way things do when you're working from partial records, and a backlog of months in which things were logged inconsistently. But they came together, and what emerged was not as bad as the first page had suggested, and not as good as it needed to be. The mortgage payment in January was the immediate problem. The chronic problem she was starting to see was Gideon's approach to suppliers. He'd been dealing with the same people in the same ways for years, which was loyal and entirely practical when times were easy and steadily expensive when margins were tight. The feed was one thing, the supply contracts for winter cattle care were another. She identified 3 areas where she thought money could be recovered simply by having a different conversation with people who'd grown accustomed to not having their terms questioned. She brought it to Gideon on a Thursday evening, 11 days after she'd arrived. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at what she'd laid out, and for a long time he didn't say anything, which she was coming to recognize as his response to receiving significant information. He went quiet and turned it over and didn't speak until he'd finished. The feed difference alone covers a quarter of the payment, she said. Harmons won't like it, he said. We've been dealing with them for 8 years. They'll like it less to lose your business entirely. I'm not suggesting you move the account, I'm suggesting you go in and have a specific conversation about price. I'm not. He stopped. I've never been good at that kind of negotiation. I know, she said. I can have it. He looked up from the ledger pages. You'd go in and talk to Harmon directly? I've been managing supplier relationships for Mrs. Patterson, she said. She's too gentle to get what she needs. I'm not. She held his gaze. It's not complicated, Gideon. It's just conversation. But it needs to be the right conversation. He was quiet for another moment, then, You've been here 11 days. I know. And He made a short motion at the organized ledger, the notes, the 3 careful columns she'd prepared. You did all this in 11 days. I had evenings. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite gratitude, because gratitude in a man like Gideon Cross would need to travel a considerable distance before it reached his face, but something that was working its way in that direction. Something that had stopped holding its breath. You're not what I expected, he said. So people keep telling me, she said. Outside the kitchen window, the plains were dark and wide and cold, and the lamp between them threw a circle of warmth on the table, and the ledger and their 2 pairs of hands resting on either side of it, his rough and deliberate, hers narrow and ink-stained at the right forefinger, and the ranch settled around them in its old, effortful way, holding itself together by will and work and whatever stubborn force keeps things from coming apart when everything is pressing against them. It was not romance. It was not ease. It was 2 practical people at a kitchen table in October, looking at numbers and problems and the shape of a possible future, and finding in that narrow overlap of need and capability something that might, with enough work and enough time, grow into something that mattered. Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, squinting against the lamplight. It's late, she said. It is, Evelyn agreed. Are you going to stay? Clara said. Not the loaded, defensive version of the question she'd asked in the first days. A plainer version, quieter. Evelyn looked at her. At this sharp-featured, cautious, grieving, stubborn child who left lamps on in the dark and offered her mother's room as a boundary and made coffee for herself because someone had to maintain the rituals. Yes, she said. I think I am. Clara looked at her for a moment longer, then turned and went back up the stairs without another word. Gideon watched his daughter go, then looked back at the ledger. He cleared his throat. I'll go to Harmon's Monday, he said. I'll come with you, Evelyn said. He didn't argue. The conversation with Harmon went the way Evelyn had predicted it would. She had ridden into Black Creek with Gideon on Monday morning, sitting beside him on the wagon seat with the ledger in her lap and the specific numbers she'd prepared the night before organized in her head. And when they walked into the feed store together, Harmon looked up from his counter with the mild surprise of a man who was accustomed to seeing Gideon Cross come through his door alone. His name was Dale Harmon, mid-50s, pear-shaped, with a mustache that he maintained with more care than most things in his establishment. He had the particular ease of a man who had held a comfortable position for long enough that he'd stopped noticing how comfortable it was. Gideon, he said. Then, with a slightly different inflection, Ma'am. Mr. Harmon, Evelyn said. I've been reviewing Mr. Cross's accounts. Harmon looked at Gideon, who had the wisdom to say nothing and let her work. His feed costs have increased 14% in the last 18 months, she said. I've been looking at comparable prices from 2 other suppliers in the region, and there's a meaningful gap between what Mr. Cross has been paying here and what's available elsewhere. She set the ledger on the counter, opened to the page she'd prepared, and slid it toward him. I'm not suggesting you've been unfair. I'm saying that 8 years of consistent business should be worth a conversation about price. Harmon looked at the ledger with the expression of a man who had not expected to be having this conversation today and was working out his position. Feed prices went up across the board, he said. That's not particular to anyone's account. Some of them did, she agreed. Not all of them, and not by this margin. She pointed to a specific line. This item in particular. Alfalfa mix. You raised it twice in 14 months. The supplier rate I've found from a mill in Abilene is 30 cents lower per hundredweight. Harmon looked at the figure. His mustache moved slightly. The Abilene mill, he said. Their quality isn't consistent. I've heard that from one person, she said. I've also heard the opposite from 3 others. But that's not the conversation we're having. The conversation is whether you'd like to keep Cross Ridge's account or whether we should go and have a word with the Abilene mill and find out about their consistency firsthand. There was a silence. Gideon was looking at a display of harness fittings on the wall with the studied attention of a man finding somewhere else to be without actually moving. Harmon tapped the ledger with one finger. I can come down 8 cents on the alfalfa mix, he said. 15, she said. And I'd like to talk about the winter supplement pricing before we leave. Harmon looked at her with the expression of a man who has lost a negotiation so gradually that he hasn't quite identified the moment it happened. 12, he said. 13.5, and we don't revisit it for a full year. A pause, then, with a short exhale that acknowledged the resolution. Fine. On the wagon back to the ranch, Gideon was quiet for a long stretch of road. The plains on either side of them were winter gray and flat, and the sky had the low-pressed quality of weather that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. 13.5 cents, he said finally. Over your typical volume, that's about $80 over the year, she said. Not enough to solve January on its own, but it's a start. He was quiet again, then, where did you learn to do that? 9 years of negotiating fabric prices for a seamstress shop in Jefferson City, she said. Suppliers test you every season. If you don't push back, they keep going. He nodded slowly. I should have been pushing back. You were doing other things, she said. Not as an excuse, just as a fact. Martha handled that side, he said. I know. She was better at it than you might think, looking at her. She was quiet, but she didn't move. He said it with the particular quality of someone describing a thing they admired without the distance to call it admiration yet. Harmon actually liked her. He'd have given her the 13.5 without the Abilene argument. Evelyn looked at the road ahead. I'm not Martha, she said. No, he said. You're not. He said it plainly, without loss in it, just as a statement of fact. Different approach, same result. He turned the wagon up the road toward Cross Ridge, and the house appeared over the rise, with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, which meant Clara had started the morning fire, and the world had not actually stopped while they were in town. She had been at Cross Ridge for just over 5 weeks when the cold came down properly. It arrived the way bad weather does on the plains. Not dramatically, but thoroughly, settling in overnight with the committed efficiency of something that had been planning this for a while. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between dusk and midnight, and by morning the creek along the eastern fence had a skim of ice on its shallows, and the water trough in the corral had to be broken open with the back of an axe. Evelyn had grown up with Missouri winters, which were nothing to be soft about, but Kansas Plains cold had a different quality. It came without barriers, without hills or tree lines to break it, moving across the flat land with nothing to slow it down but distance. It found every gap in the house, every place where the chinking between logs had loosened, every window that fit its frame less than perfectly. She and Caleb spent a morning going around the house with rags and putty, stopping drafts. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and then, without saying anything, got a rag and started on the window beside her. Other side, Evelyn said. Inside face first, then outside. Clara switched to the inside without comment. The three of them worked their way through the ground floor and part of the upstairs while Gideon and Tom Beale were out mending the north fence before the ground froze too hard to work it. By noon, the house held its heat noticeably better, and Caleb pointed this out to anyone who would listen with the satisfaction of a person who has improved a measurable thing. It's warmer, he said, at the lunch table, to nobody in particular. It is, Evelyn agreed. I helped, Clara said, directed at the table rather than at Evelyn. You did, Evelyn said. The bedroom windows were done well. Clara picked up her biscuit. She didn't say anything else, but something in the set of her shoulders was slightly different from how it had been in the morning. It was not a thaw, exactly, but it was something. The fever started on a Wednesday. Claire had been quieter than usual at breakfast. Not her habitual watchful quiet, but something flatter, with less edge to it. She ate half her oatmeal and left the rest, which was unusual enough that Caleb looked at her plate, and then at his own, and then at Evelyn with a questioning expression. Evelyn looked at Clara with the specific attention of someone cataloging symptoms without saying so. Eat the rest, Gideon said. I'm not hungry, Clara said. You need to eat. I said I'm not hungry, Papa. Her voice was thinner than normal, not petulant, thin in the way voices get when the body is spending its energy on other things. Evelyn got up and went around the table and put the back of her hand against Clara's forehead without preamble. Clara startled and pulled back. Don't, Clara said. You have a temperature, Evelyn said. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're running a fever. She looked at Gideon across the table. She needs to be in bed. Clara's expression went through several things in quick succession: protest, discomfort, and finally a kind of exhausted capitulation that was the most worrying of the three. "I don't want to miss school," she said. "School will be there Thursday," Evelyn said. Gideon had already pushed back his chair. He came around to Clara's side and looked at her with the focused alarm of a parent who has learned, through specific experience, to take childhood illness seriously. "Come on," he said. "Up." Clara let herself be led upstairs without further argument, which said more than anything else could have. By afternoon, the fever was higher. Evelyn had gotten her settled in bed with the extra quilt from the cedar chest and a damp cloth for her forehead that needed changing every 20 minutes. She'd made a willow bark tea. She'd learned it from her mother, who'd learned it from hers, a long chain of practical women passing down useful knowledge, and gotten Clara to drink most of it, though not without complaint about the taste. "It's terrible," Clara said. "It's helping." "You don't know that." "I know it well enough," Evelyn said. She wrung the cloth out in the basin and laid it back across Clara's forehead. "Stop arguing and let it work." Clara was quiet for a moment. Her face in the gray afternoon light looked younger than it did when she was healthy. The hard edges of her expression softened by the fever into something closer to what she might have looked like at 4 or 5, before she'd learned to hold herself so carefully. "I hate being sick," she said. "Most people do." When Mama was sick, she always said it was a nuisance. Clara's eyes were slightly glassy, which Evelyn noted without showing it. She said it was the body's way of complaining. "That's a reasonable way to think about it," Evelyn said. "She died of a fever," Clara said. "Did you know that?" Evelyn stopped moving for just a moment. Then she continued wringing the cloth. "Yes," she said. "Your father mentioned it." "A different kind," Clara said. "Papa said it was much worse and it went very fast, and this isn't the same thing." She said it in the particular tone of someone repeating reassurance they weren't entirely sure they believed. "He's right that it isn't the same thing," Evelyn said. "This is a winter fever. It's common in cold weather." She kept her voice even and certain, not because she was without concern, but because certainty from an adult was what a sick child needed. And she had enough experience with worry to know the difference between the kind you showed and the kind you worked with. "Are you sure?" Clara said. "I'm watching you carefully," Evelyn said. "That's what I can promise you." Clara looked at her. The glassy eyes were doing something complicated. "Okay," she said finally. She fell into a restless sleep by late afternoon. Evelyn sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe and changed the cloth and listened. Gideon came upstairs at 5. He stood in the doorway and looked at Clara asleep, and then at Evelyn in the chair. And the look on his face was the particular look of a man whose fear is specific and well-founded. A man who has already been through the worst version of this and knows exactly what it looks like when things begin to go wrong. "How high?" he said quietly. "High enough?" Evelyn said. "Not dangerous yet. I'm watching it." He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on Clara's hair, very gently, and didn't say anything for a moment. His hand was too large for the gesture, and he knew it and did it anyway. "She's a tough one," Evelyn said. "She is." His voice was rough at the edges. "Martha's fever came on fast. 2 days, and it was—" He stopped himself. "I know you said it's different." "It is different," Evelyn said. "And I need you to believe that because I need you functional. The children need their father present, not—" She paused, choosing the word, "not gone into the fear." He looked at her. The look was slightly raw, a man being seen in a way he hadn't prepared for. "I don't know how to—" He stopped again. "When Martha got sick, I didn't know what to do. I stood at the door and I felt completely—" The word he didn't say sat in the room between them. "I know," she said. "You weren't here then." "No," she said. "But I'm here now." He held her gaze for a long moment, and something in him, the rigid, carefully maintained containment of a man who had learned to hold himself very still to avoid coming apart, shifted slightly. Not broke, just shifted. "I'll stay up with her tonight," Evelyn said. "You sleep. You need to be out with Tom tomorrow, so the fence." "I can't sleep while she—" "Gideon." She said his name with a quiet authority that was not unkind. "I will wake you immediately if anything changes. That is a promise. But you being awake in the hall watching the door doesn't help her, and it doesn't help you." He stood up from the bed. He looked like a man making a decision against his own instincts, which was perhaps the hardest kind of decision to make. "You'll wake me," he said. "The moment anything changes," she said. He went out, and she heard his footsteps stop in the hall for a moment, just standing there, and then continue to his room. The night was long. Clara's fever climbed toward midnight, and Evelyn worked steadily, replacing the cloths, getting more willow bark tea into her in small amounts when she was conscious enough to drink, keeping the room warm but not overwarm, watching the pattern of her breathing with the focused attention of someone who had decided this was the thing she was doing and she was going to do it well. At 1 in the morning, Clara woke up and was disoriented for a moment and said her mother's name. Evelyn was already at the bedside. "Clara," she said. "It's Evelyn. You're at home. You're in your bed." Clara blinked. The confusion passed. "I know," she said, and her voice was steadier than Evelyn expected. "I know it's you. I was dreaming." "About your mother?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "She was in the kitchen. She was making the Thursday biscuits." "Caleb's been making those," Evelyn said, changing the cloth. "He makes them wrong," Clara said, with a flash of her normal edge that was actually reassuring. "He puts too much salt. He's learning. Mama put a little sugar in them. He doesn't know that." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then, "I could show him, if you want to tell me how much." Clara looked at her in the dim light of the lamp. Her face was flushed and her eyes were still too bright, but something in her expression was different from the guarded assessment of the past 5 weeks. Something more open in the way that illness sometimes makes people, the way it strips certain defenses that the body doesn't have the energy to maintain. "A small pinch," Clara said. "Not enough to taste, just enough so they're not dry." "I'll remember that," Evelyn said. Clara settled back against the pillow. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "Were you worried?" "Yes," Evelyn said. No hesitation, no softening. Clara seemed to absorb this. "Papa's more worried than you are," she said. "Your papa has more history with worry than I do," Evelyn said. "His worry is larger." "Because of Mama." "Yes." Clara turned the cloth on her forehead to the cooler side herself. A small, deliberate, self-sufficient gesture. "She'd have liked you," she said. "I think." Evelyn was still for just a moment. "That's a generous thing to say." "I'm not being generous," Clara said, with the directness that was the most herself thing about her. "I'm just saying what I think." She closed her eyes. "Stay close." "I'm right here," Evelyn said. The fever broke in the early hours of Friday morning, not with any drama, not with any sudden shift that announced itself. Just gradually, in the way these things go when they go well, the heat in Clara's skin eased and her breathing deepened and evened out. And by the time pale gray light was coming through the 2 windows of the hallway, Evelyn could feel, with the back of her hand, that the worst was over. She sat back in her chair and breathed. She was tired in the specific, hollowed-out way that comes after sustained vigilance. A tiredness that wasn't exactly bad, that had something earned in it, but that went right to the bone. Her neck ached from the chair. Her eyes were dry. She'd drunk 3 cups of cold tea without tasting them somewhere around 2 in the morning. She heard the footsteps in the hall before the door opened. Gideon stood in the doorway in his shirt and braces, his hair pushed to one side from the pillow, looking at Clara with the alert, braced expression of a man who has spent all night preparing himself for news and hasn't received it yet. "She's better," Evelyn said. "Fever broke an hour ago." He stepped into the room and stood at the bedside and looked at his daughter sleeping. Really sleeping now. The deep, recovery sleep that was its own kind of relief to watch. His face did something that he clearly hadn't intended to let her see, a full, unguarded passing of emotion across it. Relief and exhaustion, and something older underneath both of those. Something that had to do with 2 years of holding himself together and the specific difficulty of still being the one standing. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stayed like that for a moment. Evelyn did not look away. She let him have it. When he straightened up, his face was composed again, though the composure was more visible than it usually was. You could see the effort of it now, which meant something about what it had covered. He looked at Evelyn. "You stayed all night," he said. "I said I would. You look—" He stopped himself, apparently deciding not to finish the sentence. "Awful, probably," she said. Something crossed his face that was adjacent to a smile. "I was going to say tired." "Same thing." She pushed herself up from the chair with a creaking protest from muscles that had been still too long. "She's going to need broth when she wakes up. I'll make it before I sleep. She started toward the door. Evelyn. She turned. He was still sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, in the early morning gray, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Unmediated, unguarded, in the way people are before they've had time to put their usual defenses back on. Thank you, he said. It was 2 words. He said them plainly, without any of the elaboration that would have made them smaller. You're welcome, she said, and meant it. Pas. Caleb was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, already at the stove with the purposeful expression of a boy who has woken early because he was worried and is dealing with the worry by being useful. He had a pot of something going and was stirring it with total concentration. He looked up when she came in. Is she okay? She's okay, Evelyn said. Fever broke. He let out a breath that was far too large for a 9-year-old's body, a breath that had clearly been held for some time. He turned back to the pot and stirred it again. I made oatmeal, he said. I didn't know what else to do. That's exactly the right thing, she said. He nodded, still stirring. Then, without turning around, Were you scared? She sat down at the table. Yes, she said, but being scared and being useful are not incompatible. He thought about this. Okay, he said. She watched him finish the oatmeal with his characteristic steady care, and she thought about Clara saying stay close in the dim lamplight, and about the small pinch of sugar in the biscuits that Caleb didn't know about, and about the way Gideon's face had moved when he'd seen his daughter sleeping safely. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not comfort exactly. She did not reach for comfortable words to describe uncomfortable things, but was perhaps the beginning of understanding what she had actually come here for. Not management, not accounts and supplier negotiations and drafts stopped with rags and putty. Not the useful arrangement between 2 practical people that they'd both been careful to call it. Something that had started as a transaction and was becoming slowly and without announcement, a life. Outside the kitchen window, the plains stretched out in the morning light, and the frost on the grass caught what sun there was and held it. Caleb put a bowl of oatmeal in front of her without being asked and went back to the stove, and she sat at the table in the warm kitchen of Cross Ridge Ranch and ate it, and was grateful, quietly and without drama, in the way of a person who has learned not to take the quiet mornings for granted. Clara recovered in the way children recover when they are fundamentally healthy and have been properly cared for, quickly, and with a thoroughness that made the severity of the preceding days feel almost like something imagined. By Saturday, she was sitting up. By Sunday, she was at the kitchen table complaining that the oatmeal was too thick, which Caleb took as a personal affront and Evelyn took as a reliable indicator that the worst was genuinely behind them. Gideon said almost nothing about the night Evelyn had kept watch. He was not a man who returned to things once they'd been addressed, and she understood this and did not push on it. But something had shifted in the way he moved around the house, the way he spoke to her. A small but legible change, like a door that had been stuck and was now opening with less resistance. He still wasn't easy. He still went quiet when he had something significant to process, still held himself with the careful self-containment of a man who had learned that letting things out tended to make them harder to put back. But he had stopped watching her with the guarded uncertainty of the early weeks. Whatever remaining question he'd been carrying about whether she belonged at Cross Ridge, the fever had answered it in a way that no amount of account-keeping or supplier negotiation could have. Ruth Holt came by on the Tuesday after Clara's recovery and sat at the kitchen table and drank her coffee and listened to the account of the fever with the focused, practical attention of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own and knew exactly what sustained vigilance through a bad night cost a person. When Evelyn finished, Ruth set her cup down and was quiet for a moment. You stayed up the whole night, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was different from the assessing look of their first meeting. Simpler. More direct. I'll say what I should have said 3 weeks ago, she said. You're good for this family. Evelyn did not perform modesty because Ruth was not a woman who respected performed modesty. I'm trying to be useful, she said. There's useful, and there's what you did Thursday night, Ruth said. Those aren't the same category. She picked up her cup again. Boyd wants to know if Gideon needs help with the north fence. He's got a slow week. That would be welcome, Evelyn said. Tell him Tuesday, if the weather holds. Ruth nodded and finished her coffee and left. And Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and watched the wagon go back up the road toward the Holt Ranch, and felt something that she recognized cautiously as the beginning of belonging. Not arrival, not completion. Just the first thin roots of a thing that might, with enough time and enough weather survived together, grow into something that held. January arrived with its payment and its reckoning, and Evelyn had spent 6 weeks preparing for both. The conversation with Harmon had recovered a portion. A second conversation, this one with the man who held the supply contract for the winter cattle supplement, a weathered trader named Pollock, who came through from Wichita twice a year, had recovered another. She had found a discrepancy in the previous year's accounts, an overcharge on a lumber delivery that Gideon had signed for without checking the itemization, and a letter to the lumber yard had produced a credit she hadn't been certain would materialize, but had. She had reorganized the household expenditures with a thoroughness that had initially surprised Gideon and eventually simply become normal, the way Evelyn did things, which was with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, without drama and without waiting to be asked. The January payment was still large. What she had recovered and reorganized did not make it small, but it made it manageable, and manageable was a different country from where Cross Ridge had been standing in October. She sat across from Gideon at the kitchen table on the 2nd of January with the ledger between them and laid out the numbers plainly, the way she always laid out numbers, without softening and without alarm, just as information that needed to be acted on. Gideon looked at the bottom figure for a long time. "We're short," he said. "By $112, she said. "Yes." He sat back in his chair. The lamp between them threw its familiar circle of light, and outside the kitchen window the January plains were dark and cold and absolute. "I can go to the bank," he said. "Take a short loan against the spring cattle income." "That's one option," she said. "There's another." He looked at her. "Boyd Holt mentioned to Ruth that he's been looking to expand his herd for spring. He's looking for good breeding stock." She had been carrying this piece of information for 4 days, turning it over, making sure it was right before she said it. "You've got 3 breeding cows on the north pasture that aren't carrying their weight in terms of production. You've told me so yourself. If you sold them to Holt at a fair price, you'd cover the gap and clear a problem from the north herd at the same time." Ochki. Gideon looked at the ledger. "Those are Cross Ridge cattle," he said. "They are," she said. "And the ranch is better served by selling 3 animals that aren't producing than by taking on debt that costs interest against a spring income that isn't guaranteed." She kept her voice even. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see in the numbers." He was quiet for a while, long enough that Caleb, who had been sitting at the far end of the table supposedly working on his sums, looked up from his paper and then quickly looked back down. 3 cows, Gideon said. 3 cows and a clean payment, she said. Another silence. Then, "You'd negotiate the price with Holt?" "If you want me to," she said, "or you can do it yourself. He'll give you fair value. He's a straight dealer." He nodded slowly, turning it over in the particular deliberate way he turned things over. "Talk to him," he said. She did, the following Thursday, when Ruth brought Boyd by the ranch to look at the north fence repair that he and Tom Beal had completed in December. A solid week of work that had left the north pasture properly enclosed for the first time in over a year, and Boyd had done it with goodwill and without invoice, which was the kind of neighborliness that still existed in these territories between people who understood that a community was only as strong as its least maintained fence line. Boyd Holt was a wide, quiet man who looked at cattle with the focused appreciation of someone who genuinely loved the animals and found them interesting, which Evelyn respected. She showed him the 3 cows in the north pasture, and he looked at them for a while without speaking, moving around them slowly, and then gave her a price that was within $4 of what she'd calculated as fair. $3 more, she said. He looked at her with mild surprise, not offense, just recalibration. Then he looked at the cows again. 2, he said. "Done," she said, and they shook hands in the cold pasture with the January wind cutting across the flattened grass, and she walked back to the house knowing that the January payment was covered and that Cross Ridge Ranch had made it through its first winter, with her in it without going under. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt the way she felt when she finished a difficult piece of sewing, satisfied that the work had been done properly, and aware of the next piece waiting. It was Ruth who first used the word that Evelyn had been careful not to use herself. She said it in March, when the ground had started to think about thawing, and the days were lengthening by enough increments that you could feel the change even if you couldn't quite see it yet. She said it sitting at the Cross Ridge kitchen table, which had become something of a regular occurrence by then, Ruth came by twice a week with the comfortable ease of a woman who had decided that a friendship had been established and was now maintaining it without ceremony. "You're not the housekeeper," Ruth said. "You know that." Evelyn was mending one of Caleb's shirts. "I keep the house," she said. "You know what I mean?" Ruth set down her coffee cup. "You run this place, the accounts, the suppliers, the negotiations. You managed the North Herd rotation with Tom last month when Gideon was down with his back. You sit at that table every evening like it's where you've always sat." She looked at Evelyn with the plain, friendly directness that was her primary mode. "You're his partner." Evelyn kept her needle moving. "We have an arrangement." "An arrangement," Ruth repeated with the flat emphasis of a woman repeating a word she finds inadequate. "Is that what he calls it?" "It's what we both call it," Evelyn said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Not a challenging quiet, a thoughtful one, the quiet of a woman choosing her words because she had something she actually wanted to say. "Martha and Gideon were married 18 years, she said. "I knew them both from before. He is not an easy man to know. He was not easy for Martha, and she loved him straightforwardly from the beginning, which made it possible, worth it." She paused. "He has a great deal of himself that he keeps in a room he doesn't open for most people." "I've noticed," Evelyn said. "He opened it for Martha." Ruth picked up her cup. "He doesn't know how to do that again. He hasn't figured out how to want something new without it feeling like it costs him the old thing." She looked at Evelyn carefully. "That's not a warning. I just think you should understand what you're working with." "I'm not working at anything," Evelyn said. Ruth smiled slightly, the smile of a woman who knows the difference between what people say and what they mean. "Of course not," she said. The man who came to Cross Ridge in late March had not been invited and was not welcome. His name was Doyle Garrett, and he arrived on a gray Wednesday morning in a good coat and a hired horse, which established immediately that he was a man who came from town rather than from the land. He was perhaps 45, with a lean face and small eyes, and the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had learned to look less purposeful than he was. Evelyn was in the yard when he rode up, hanging washing on the line with Clara. Clara had begun helping without being asked about 6 weeks prior, which Evelyn had accepted without comment, because making a point of it would have been the fastest way to make it stop. "I'm looking for Gideon Cross," Garrett said from horseback. "He's in the south pasture," Evelyn said. "Is he expecting you?" "I represent the Western Territories Land Company," Garrett said. He said it with the ease of a man who expected the name to do work. "We've been in correspondence with Mr. Cross regarding his property." Evelyn looked at him. "I'm not aware of any correspondence with the land company." "It may have come in before your time," he said pleasantly. "I handle Mr. Cross's correspondence," she said. "I've been doing so since November." Something moved behind Garrett's eyes. A small adjustment, a recalibration. He smiled with his mouth without it reaching much further. Perhaps he handled this one personally. It concerns a purchase offer on the north section of his property. "Please wait here," Evelyn said. She handed her half of the washing to Clara without a word, and Clara took it without a word. And Evelyn walked to the barn and saddled Bess and rode out to the south pasture. Gideon was there with Tom, moving the herd to fresh grass, and he looked up at her approach with the particular alert expression he'd learned to associate with her riding out to him, which meant something that couldn't wait. "Man named Doyle Garrett," she said, "Western Territories Land Company. Claims he's been in correspondence with you about a purchase offer on the north section." Gideon's expression did something immediate and recognizable. "That was in August," he said, when I was in the worst of it with the debt. I wrote back and told them I wasn't interested." "Did you keep the correspondence?" "I don't," he thought. "It might be in the desk, the lower drawer." "I haven't seen it," she said, "which is possible if you filed it yourself before November." She looked at him directly. "What was the offer?" "Below value," he said. "Well below. They dressed it up, but it was a low offer for the north section, and the north section is where the creek access is. Without the creek, the south pasture has water problems by midsummer." She understood immediately. "They knew that," she said. "Almost certainly. And they're here in March, after a hard winter, hoping the financial pressure has changed your answer." She looked back toward the ranch house, where Garrett was presumably still waiting in the yard. "Don't come in yet," she said. "Give me 20 minutes. "Evelyn, I'm not going to sign anything," she said. "I'm going to find out what they actually want." She turned Bess and rode back. Garrett had dismounted and was standing in the yard with the patient ease of a man accustomed to waiting people out. Clara was sitting on the porch railing watching him with her arms crossed and an expression of comprehensive suspicion that Evelyn found, in that moment, genuinely gratifying. "Mr. Garrett," she said, dismounting, "please come inside." She made him coffee because that was what you did, and because it gave her something to do while she looked at him across the kitchen table and assessed the specific shape of what he'd come to accomplish. He produced a letter from his coat, a formal document on company stationery, folded precisely. He slid it across the table toward her. "Our updated offer," he said. "More favorable than what we sent in August, I believe Mr. Cross will find." She read it carefully. It was in fact more favorable than August, by 12%, which sounded meaningful until you held it against what the north section was actually worth with its creek access intact. The offer was still designed to look reasonable while being, on examination, a transfer of value from Gideon to the company, at a rate that only made sense if Gideon was desperate. She folded the letter and placed it flat on the table in front of her. "May I ask a question?" she said. "Of course," Garrett said. "What does the Western Territories Land Company intend to do with the north section if they acquire it?" He smiled. "Development, settlement. The company invests in frontier territories. Specifically," she said, "because creek access on a section that size, in this location, is valuable beyond settlement. It's valuable for any operation that needs reliable water on the North Plain." She looked at him without warmth or hostility, just with directness. "There's a cattle company operating 60 miles northwest of here that's been expanding south. I'd be interested to know whether your company has a relationship with them." The smile stayed on Garrett's face, but the quality of it changed slightly. "Our business relationships are confidential," he said. "I'm sure they are," she said. "I'm also sure that you're here in March because you know that the January payment has come and gone, and you're hoping the winter left this ranch weakened enough to reconsider." She placed her hands flat on the table on either side of the letter. "It didn't. Cross Ridge made its January payment, and the north fence is repaired and the herd rotation is working. This ranch is in better shape than it was 6 months ago." Garrett looked at her for a moment. The easy manner was still there, but it had acquired a careful quality. "You're very informed about the ranch's finances," he said. "I am," she said, "because I manage them." "And you are—" He left it open, an invitation to define herself. "I am the person you're negotiating with," she said. "And the answer is the same as August. Cross Ridge is not selling the north section." He looked at the letter still sitting on the table between them. "Perhaps Mr. Cross would like to—" "Mr. Cross's position is the same as mine," she said, "which is the same as his position in August, when he told you no in writing." She stood up. "Thank you for coming out. I'll tell him you called." Garrett took the letter back without urgency, folding it carefully, the way a man folds a card he intends to play again later. He stood and put on his hat and went to the door and turned. "The offer won't stay at this number indefinitely," he said. "I don't expect it will," she said. He left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride back up the road toward town and did not move until he was out of sight. Clara appeared beside her. "Who was he really?" she said. "A man who thought this ranch was struggling enough to take a bad deal," Evelyn said. "Is it? Struggling?" "Less than it was," Evelyn said, "and less than he thought." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking out at the road. "You made him leave," she said. It was not a question. "I told him the truth and let him draw his own conclusions," Evelyn said. Claire considered this, filing it somewhere. "Good," she said. She told Gideon all of it that evening, plainly and completely, including the part about the cattle company to the northwest, which was a guess but an educated one that she thought he should be carrying. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his habit, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He'll be back," he said. "Probably," she said, "with a different approach. Or someone else will come with a similar one." She looked at the lamp on the table between them. "The north section has something they want specifically. It's not just settlement." "The water," he said. "The water," she agreed. "If someone's expanding a large cattle operation south and they need reliable water access on the North Plain, that creek section is worth considerably more than what Garrett offered, which means someone is either not telling him the real value, or he knows and is hoping we don't." Gideon looked at her with the particular expression he'd developed for moments when she'd laid out a thing he hadn't seen coming. It was not surprise exactly. It was something more like respect wearing surprise's clothes. "How did you know about the cattle company to the northwest?" he said. "Pollock mentioned it when I renegotiated the supplement contract," she said. He sells to them too. I listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to get the north section assessed properly. Current market value, with the water access factored in. Yes, she said. And you should probably talk to a lawyer about what the formal position looks like if they come back with a more aggressive offer. I don't know a lawyer, he said. In town. Ruth's husband Boyd uses a man named Elias Crow in Wichita, she said. He's apparently solid. I can write to him. Gideon looked at her. The look was direct and unguarded in the way that had become more common since January, since the fever, since the payment, since the incremental accumulation of shared difficulty that had the effect between two people of making pretense more trouble than it was worth. You think of everything, he said. Not everything, she said. I miss things. I missed the fact that the east fence gate was hanging wrong for 3 weeks because I didn't know what right looked like. Tom fixed it. Tom fixed it because Tom noticed, she said. I should have noticed. He almost smiled. She was getting better at reading the almost smiles, the slight shift in the lines beside his mouth, the almost imperceptible softening of the set of his jaw. You can't know everything, he said. No, she agreed, but I can keep learning what I don't know. She closed the ledger. The thing about Garrett, she stopped. What? She said the thing she'd been thinking since the moment she'd watched him ride away. He came here because he thought this was a ranch in trouble, with no one strong at the wheel. He came in March because he thought a hard winter would have made it worse. She looked up. He was wrong about both. But if I hadn't been here in November, if you'd still been managing alone, he might not have been wrong. Gideon held her gaze. The truth of it sat between them, without either of them needing to say what it was. I know that, he said. I'm not saying it to... I know why you're saying it, he said. You're saying it because you're making a case, and you're right to make it. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table in the deliberate posture of a man who has decided to say something carefully. 3 months was what you said. In October, 3 months to see if it worked. He paused. It's been 5. I know, she said. The arrangement, he said, and the word had the slight self-consciousness of a word being acknowledged as inadequate. It's not... I'm aware that it's not what either of us would have designed if we were designing something. Nobody designs their life, she said. You work with what comes. Yes. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. I want to make it formal, if you're willing. A proper marriage, not just... I know what you mean, she said. I'm not going to... He stopped, choosing words. I don't have speeches in me. I don't know how to make it sound like something it isn't. It's... You're the person I want at this table. You're the person I want in this house. You're the person I trust with the things that matter. He held her gaze with a steadiness that cost him something. That's what I have. She looked at him for a long moment, at this difficult, careful, weathered man with his enormous hands and his almost smiles and his habit of going quiet when things meant the most to him, who had fumbled her arrival and made her walk down a dusty street with nowhere to go, and had then, incrementally and without ceremony, become someone she understood in the specific way you understand the people you live alongside through hard seasons. Yes, she said. He nodded once, with the same simplicity he'd used in August on that dusty street when he'd withdrawn his offer, but this was its opposite. The same plainness applied to the opposite direction, and it meant more for being simple. I'll ask Reverend... He stopped. I'll find out who does the civil ceremony in town, he said. Mrs. Patterson will want to know, Evelyn said. She'll be put out if she hears it secondhand. He almost smiled. Anyone else? Ruth, she said. She'll be pleased, and she won't say so, and she'll bring food. She always brings food, he said. Then she'll bring more of it, Evelyn said. Tuolchin. The wedding was on a Saturday in early April, in the front room of the house, with Boyd and Ruth Holt standing as witnesses, and Tom Beale in his best shirt, and Mrs. Patterson, who had indeed been told in advance and had indeed brought food, and Caleb, who wore the expression of a boy watching something he'd been privately hoping for and had not allowed himself to say. Clara stood beside her brother in a dress that Evelyn had made for her from a bolt of blue wool that Clara had chosen herself, and she watched the civil proceeding with the composed seriousness of a child who has decided to receive this with dignity. When it was done and the modest celebration was occupying the kitchen, Clara appeared at Evelyn's elbow. I'm not calling you mother, she said. Quietly, for Clara's ears only, which Evelyn understood was its own form of consideration. I'm not asking you to, Evelyn said. Clara looked at her. Something in the look was careful and honest and slightly young, in a way she didn't often allow. "But I don't want to call you Miss Harper anymore either," she said. "You haven't been calling me anything," Evelyn said. "I know." A pause. "I've been working up to it." Evelyn waited. "Evelyn," Clara said, testing it, feeling the weight of it. "That's my name," Evelyn said. Clara nodded once, satisfied with something only she could fully articulate, and turned back toward the kitchen where Mrs. Patterson was cutting cake, and Caleb was positioned strategically close to the largest slice. Gideon appeared beside her a moment later and stood where Clara had stood. He had a cup of coffee. He didn't say anything immediately, just looked out at the room, at Tom laughing at something Boyd said, at Ruth arranging food with unnecessary precision, at his son positioning himself near the cake, at his daughter crossing the room with her characteristic directness towards something she'd decided she wanted. "Good house," he said finally, quietly. She looked out at the same room, at what it was, which was not smooth or easy or resolved, but was real, was people who had found their way to the same table through various difficulties, and were here now, in April light, with coffee and cake, and the incremental work of choosing each other still ahead. "Yes," she said. Outside, the April plains were waking up from winter with the particular indifference of land that does not wait for human events to be ready. The grass was coming in thin and green along the creek bank, and somewhere in the north pasture the cattle that belonged to this ranch were grazing on rotation, as they should be. The fence held. The accounts balanced. The house was warm. It was not a perfect life. It was the kind of life where the gate hung wrong for 3 weeks, and the biscuits were too salty, and the man you'd married still sometimes went somewhere unreachable in his own mind when the grief came on him, and you had to learn to be patient with that, to not take it personally, to let him come back on his own terms. It was the kind of life where a child's trust came in increments so small they were almost invisible, and where you had to keep showing up the same way every day and let time do the work you couldn't rush. It was the kind of life that was worth keeping. She drank her coffee and stood in the front room of Cross Ridge Ranch on the first day of being married to Gideon Cross, and she let herself have the simple, unperformed satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it had been given to her, but because she had built it, carefully and without anyone's permission, from nothing but her own stubborn, practical, undeceived self. The letter from Elias Crow arrived on a Tuesday in May, 3 weeks after Evelyn had written to him. It was thorough, which she appreciated, and direct, which she appreciated more. He had looked into the Western Territories Land Company at her request, and had found what she'd suspected but needed confirmed. The company was operating as an acquisition front for a larger cattle operation based out of Colorado, a concern called the Meridian Cattle Syndicate that had been buying up water-adjacent land across 3 territories for the past 4 years. Their method was consistent: approach during winter or drought, offer below value, rely on financial pressure to do what persuasion couldn't. They had acquired 11 properties in 18 months. In 2 of those cases, the original owners had later discovered that the land they'd sold contained mineral rights or water access worth substantially more than the purchase price. In both cases, the sellers had no legal recourse because the sales had been conducted correctly on paper. Evelyn read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at it for a moment with the flat, assessing calm she brought to information that confirmed something she'd already suspected but had hoped was wrong. She wrote back to Crow that afternoon with 3 questions and a request that he determine the precise legal status of the creek access rights on the north section, whether they were attached to the land title or whether they could, under any interpretation, be separated and sold independently. She had a reason for asking this that she hadn't told Gideon yet, because she wasn't sure of it herself, and she didn't present things to Gideon until she was sure. She was sure by the end of the week. Garrett came back in June, as she'd predicted he would. He came with a colleague this time, a younger man named Sears, who carried a leather case and had the careful, deferential manner of someone whose job was to make legal documents look inevitable. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Gideon was in the south pasture and Tom was repairing a section of the east fence, and the children were at school, and Evelyn was in the yard staking the kitchen garden she'd put in along the south wall of the house in April. A practical garden, not decorative, with vegetables that would actually be eaten: potatoes, beans, onions, squash, and a row of herbs along the border that Clara had asked for, and then pretended she hadn't. She saw them coming up the road and stood up from the garden and waited. "Mrs. Cross," Garrett said. He used her married name with the ease of someone who had done his research. He dismounted, and his colleague did the same. "We were hoping to speak with your husband." "He's working," she said. "You can speak with me." Garrett looked at her with the pleasant, noncommittal expression she'd seen in March. But there was something different in it this time, something more deliberate. He'd come prepared. "Our business today is a formal offer," he said. "Legal documents are involved. We'd really prefer to—" "Mr. Garrett," she said, "if you've brought legal documents, I'm the right person to receive them. I manage this ranch's legal and financial affairs." She looked at the younger man. "Mr. Sears, why don't you come inside?" She gave them coffee because that was what you did, and because the ritual of it gave her something to do with her hands while she read, and she needed to read carefully. The document Sears produced was 12 pages, which was about 10 pages more than any legitimate simple purchase offer required. And the language was the kind of language designed to look precise while actually being elastic, full of definitions nested inside definitions, contingency clauses that appeared protective but were not, and one particular paragraph on page 8 that would, if signed, allow the Western Territories Land Company to exercise a right of first refusal on any future sale of any portion of the Cross Ridge property for a period of 25 years. 25 years. She read that paragraph 3 times and kept her face completely still. "The offer itself," she said when she'd finished. "The purchase price for the north section." Sears quoted the figure. It was higher than March. Higher than what Crow had assessed as the below-value offer from August. It was, on its surface, a number that could look reasonable to someone who hadn't spent the last 3 months learning exactly what creek access on the North Plain was worth to a cattle syndicate trying to expand south. "I see," she said. She set the document down on the table with the same flat precision she'd used in March. "I need to point out that this offer is still below the assessed value of the north section with water rights intact." She turned to page 4 of the document. "Your company's own survey, referenced here, values the water access at a figure that, added to the land price, puts the actual value at roughly 30% above what you're offering." Sears glanced at Garrett. Garrett kept his pleasant expression. "That survey addresses the creek access in a different context," he said. "The offer is for the land section. Water rights are a separate consideration." "They are inseparable," she said. "The water rights are attached to the land title by the original claim documentation from 1871. I have a letter from our attorney in Wichita confirming this." She had the letter from Crow in her apron pocket, and she set it on the table beside the 12-page document without opening it. "Which means the offer as presented is for a piece of property whose primary value you've characterized as separate. That's not a purchase offer. That's a misdirection." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, a breeze moved through the kitchen garden, and the bean stakes shifted slightly and settled. Garrett leaned forward. The pleasant manner had not left his face, but it had changed quality. It was working harder now. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. The Meridian Syndicate—" He stopped himself and then kept going, apparently deciding that the pretense of the land company name had outlived its usefulness. "The company I represent has significant resources and significant patience. This offer is genuinely favorable. The alternative, in time, is that we acquire neighboring properties and the water situation on the south pasture becomes—" "A problem," she said. "A consideration," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the ledger in October, with the flat, intelligent attention of someone reading a thing for what it actually said rather than what it claimed to say. "What you're describing," she said, "is a plan to create a problem and then offer to solve it. That's not a negotiation. That's a threat wearing a business coat." She stood up. "Cross Ridge is not selling the north section. Not at this price, not under these terms, and not with a 25-year right of first refusal buried on page 8 of a document you hoped we wouldn't read carefully." She picked up the 12 pages and held them out to Sears. "Take your document. You're welcome to make a fair offer, which means full value, water rights included, no contingency clauses. And if you do that, we'll consider it like adults. But this version goes home with you." Sears took the document. He looked slightly pale. Garrett looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had finally dropped the pleasant mask entirely, and what was underneath it was not quite hostility. It was something more like genuine surprise, the expression of a man who had walked into a situation he'd assessed incorrectly and was recalibrating in real time. "You've been well prepared," he said. It came out almost as a compliment. "I read carefully," she said. "It's not complicated." They left. She stood at the kitchen window again and watched them go up the road. And this time she felt something different from March. Not just relief, not just the satisfaction of a problem handled, but something with more weight to it. An understanding of what had almost happened. What could have happened in October or August, or any of the months before she'd come to Cross Ridge and started reading the numbers with the specific attention they deserved. She went out to the south pasture and found Gideon. She told him the same way she told him everything. Plainly, sequentially, all of it, including the page 8 paragraph, and Garrett's near admission of the Meridian Syndicate's name and the strategy of acquiring neighboring properties to create water pressure. She told him standing in the south pasture with the June grass long around their boots and the cattle moving in the middle distance and the sky above them the enormous, indifferent blue of a Kansas summer. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Page 8, he said. 25 years, she said. He took his hat off and held it at his side and looked out across the pasture. The gesture was one she knew by now. The hat came off when he was dealing with something significant, when the situation called for more of him than he'd had ready. If I'd signed that in August, he said. You didn't, she said. I almost did, he said. In August, I was close to... He stopped. I was carrying a lot and not managing it well, and they came in August because they knew that. They timed it. Yes, she said, and they came back now because they thought the winter would have finished what August started, she said. It didn't. He turned to look at her. The sun was behind her, and he was looking at her straight on. This man she had married in April, in a front room with Ruth's food and Mrs. Patterson's approval and his daughter testing her name like a new word. And he looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of someone who has understood the shape of a thing and is not pretending otherwise. No, he said. It didn't. She held his gaze. There were things in the moment that didn't need words, and she'd learned in 7 months at Cross Ridge that Gideon Cross understood this, that he was, beneath the quiet and the containment, a man who felt things with considerable depth and had simply learned to carry them in a specific way. She respected the way he carried things. She'd stopped trying to change it. I'm going to write to Crow again, she said. I want documentation of the water rights attached to the title filed properly in the county records. Something that makes it explicitly clear and legally unambiguous, so that no future offer can characterize the water access as separable. He nodded. Do it, he said. It'll cost something in legal fees. Do it anyway, he said. She put her hat back on and turned to walk back to the house, and he fell into step beside her across the south pasture grass, and they walked back to the ranch in the early summer afternoon without speaking, which was also one of the things she'd learned about Cross Ridge, that silence between people who understood each other was not empty. It was full of everything that had already been said and everything that didn't need saying. Quote, the summer brought work, which was its own kind of steady satisfaction. The kitchen garden came in well, better than she'd expected for a first year in that soil, which was thinner along the south wall than she'd assessed. But potatoes and squash were forgiving, and the beans had gone in properly, and the herbs along the border were thriving with a consistency that Clara monitored with a proprietary attention she continued to maintain was practical rather than personal. The time is coming, Clara said one morning in July, standing at the garden border with her arms crossed in her habitual posture of assessment. It is, Evelyn agreed. Rosemary's slow. Rosemary always takes a season to establish, Evelyn said. It'll do better next year. Clara crouched down and looked at the rosemary with the specific frown of someone who found slowness personally inconvenient. I want to try it in the bread, she said. We can try the time first, Evelyn said. Let me show you which quantity. She had been teaching Clara to cook, not in the systematic way of instruction, but in the way things actually got learned, standing beside each other in the kitchen with the actual work in front of them, doing it wrong sometimes and working out why and doing it less wrong the next time. Clara learned fast and was competitive about it, which was a useful trait in a cook. She did not like being bad at things. She was occasionally impatient with the processes that required waiting, the bread that needed to rise, the beans that needed soaking, the slow stock that needed hours on the stove. But she was thorough when she committed, and she had in June successfully made the Thursday biscuits with the small pinch of sugar that had been the missing element since October. Caleb had eaten too and then looked at them with honest assessment. They're better, he said. Clara had received this with composure. Later, when Caleb was outside, she'd told Evelyn that she thought her mother would have approved, and then she'd gone upstairs before Evelyn could respond, which was her way of saying something significant, while maintaining the option to pretend she hadn't. Evelyn let her have it. That was also one of the things you learned. Quiet. The letter from Crow in August confirmed that the water rights documentation had been filed correctly with the county, attached to the Cross Ridge land title, in terms that were, in his words, unambiguous and litigation-resistant. He had also, at Evelyn's earlier request, researched the current status of the Meridian Syndicate's expansion in the territory and had found that 2 of their recent acquisition attempts had fallen through. One, because the landowner had obtained independent legal counsel, and one because a local newspaper in a neighboring county had run a story on the syndicate's acquisition methods that had made several potential sellers considerably more cautious. She showed the letter to Gideon, who read it and set it down with the deliberate satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a thing to be finished and has watched it finish. "That's it then," he said. "For now," she said. "They may try again in a few years when they think we've forgotten." "Will we have forgotten?" She looked at him. "No." He almost smiled. The almost smiles were fuller now than they'd been in October. She could actually read them, could see the warmth in them. 7 months of living alongside someone in the specific difficulty of a real life had that effect. You stopped seeing the surface and started seeing the person under it. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her out to the north section that afternoon, something he hadn't done before, not the way he did it now, which was with the deliberate quality of a man taking someone somewhere he valued rather than just walking land. The north section was the longest and flattest of the Cross Ridge parcels, and it ran along the creek for about a quarter mile before the water bent west toward the Holt property. The grass was summer tall, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf, throwing cool, shifting shade over the bank, and the creek itself was running well for August, better than it had been the previous year, Tom had said, which suggested the season's rain had been adequate in the hills to the north. He stopped at the creek bank and stood with his hands in his pockets. "My father homesteaded this section," he said, "before the south. He always said the north was where the ranch actually began, because of the water." He looked at the creek. "I've been stupid about it, not paying enough attention to what it was worth, not protecting it the way I should have." "You were managing other things," she said. "I was," he said, "but this—" He made a motion with one hand that encompassed the creek, the cottonwoods, the long grass going to seed in the late summer heat. "This is what the ranch stands on, literally." He turned to look at her. "You understood that before I said it." "I read the land survey in November," she said. "The water access was the first thing I looked at." "Of course it was," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite wonder, but was adjacent to both. He looked back at the creek. "Martha loved this spot," he said. "She used to bring the children here in summer and let them play in the shallows." He paused. "I haven't been back here since I've been managing the land, but I haven't been back here." Evelyn said nothing. She stood beside him at the creek bank and let the quiet be what it was, which was both a grief and a continuation, both a loss and an ongoing life, in the way that real things are always more than one thing at once. After a while he said, "Thank you. For the north section, for the letter to Crow, the documentation, all of it." "You don't have to thank me for that," she said. "It's this ranch as much as yours now." He turned to look at her. The look was full and direct, the look of a man who has stopped keeping things at a careful distance and has chosen, deliberately and without pretense, to let them be close. "Yes," he said, "it is." She took his hand, which she rarely did. She was not by nature demonstrative, and neither was he, and they had built their closeness in other ways, through shared work and honest speech, and the 1,000 small acts of daily life conducted alongside each other. But she took his hand at the creek bank in August, in the shifting shade of the cottonwoods his father had planted, and he held it with the same deliberate care he gave to everything that mattered to him. They stood there for a while. The creek ran over its stones with its indifferent, persistent sound. The cottonwood leaves moved. A hawk went over high and slow and was gone. Tom Farley came to Cross Ridge in September. Not Doyle Garrett, not anyone from the Meridian Syndicate. Tom Farley, the man from the general store in October. The first of the 3 who had delivered his assessment of Evelyn's unsuitability free of charge on the day she arrived in Black Creek. He came on a Saturday afternoon in his own wagon, without apparent business, and Evelyn was in the yard splitting kindling when he rode up, and she looked at him and waited. He got down from the wagon slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say and is now less certain of it than he was in the rehearsal. He held his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mr. Farley," she said. He looked at the yard, the house, the kitchen garden, the evidence of a ranch that was in considerably better shape than the general territory knowledge would have suggested it should be by this point in the season. She watched him take it in. I came to... He stopped, started again. I heard about the land company business and the water rights. He turned his hat in his hands. Word gets around. It does, she said. I wanted to say... He stopped again. The hat turned. I said something rude to you in October, in the general store. I said something I had no call to say. She looked at him. He was not a bad man, she had decided months ago, based on what Ruth had said and what she'd gathered from other sources. He was a man who spoke without thinking, and who had learned most of his opinions from the air around him rather than from particular reflection, which was not unusual. He was also standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, a man doing something that was evidently difficult for him, which she was not without respect for. You said you could see why Mr. Cross had passed on me, she said, based on looking at me for approximately 30 seconds. He flushed. Yes, that's what I said. It was a rude thing to say, she agreed. It was. And it was wrong, she said. Not with sharpness, just as a fact. It was, he said again. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd gotten down from the wagon. I've been managing my ranch without a partner for 11 years, since my wife left. And the accounts are a mess and the supplier relationships are a mess, and I've been doing things the same way for so long that I didn't notice how wrong they'd gotten. He paused. I've been watching what you did with Cross Ridge, through the winter. The Harmon negotiation got around. The land company business got around. Everything gets around. He shifted his weight. I was wondering if you might know anyone, any woman who might be looking for a... I'm not a matchmaker, Mr. Farley, she said. No, he said. I know. I just thought... I'll tell you what I think, she said. I think the problem is not that you don't have the right woman. I think the problem is your accounts, and I think you should hire a bookkeeper before you think about anything else. Someone to come in once a week and put things in order. She looked at him steadily. And I think you should learn to listen to what people say rather than what you expect them to say. Those two things together would improve your situation considerably. He blinked. He had, she thought, expected either anger or forgiveness, and had received instead practical advice, which was perhaps more useful than either. That's fair, he said. There's a woman in Black Creek named Mrs. Patterson, she said. She does sewing work, but her background is accounting. She kept books for her husband's business for 15 years. Her eyesight is going, and she's been looking for work she can do that doesn't require fine, close vision. She paused. Go talk to her. Tell her I sent you. Pay her fairly. He nodded slowly, absorbing this. I will, he said. He left with his hat still in his hands, and she watched him go and thought about October, about standing on the bench on the main street of Black Creek with her carpet bag and her hat box, and the laughter drifting over from the saloon, and about the specific heaviness of being found wanting in public, and about the particular decision she'd made in that moment to stand up and walk anyway. She had not proven herself to Tom Farley. She had simply kept going until the question of his opinion became irrelevant. That was not the same thing, and the difference mattered. Gideon came home in late September with a piece of news that Evelyn had not anticipated. He'd been in town for supplies and had stopped at the post office, and he came through the kitchen door with an envelope in his hand and a look on his face that she'd learned to read as the look of a man who was carrying something he hadn't processed yet. Harvey Doone, he said. She looked up from the account ledger. What about him? He set the envelope on the table. It was a letter from Doone's attorney, which was already unusual. He's selling, Gideon said. The Doone Cattle Company. The whole operation. He's moving east. His wife's family. She wants to be closer to them. He sat down and turned the envelope in his hands. He's selling the house, and the stock, and the land. All of it. She waited. His north pasture borders our north section, Gideon said. A quarter-mile of shared fence line. She understood immediately. If the Meridian Syndicate buys it, they get creek access anyway, he said, from the other side. He looked at the envelope. Doone's attorney wrote because apparently Doone himself remembered the business with the land company and thought I should know before it went to general listing. She sat back in her chair. The September light was coming through the kitchen window at the low angle of the season, warm and amber, and already with a hint of the coming cold in it. She thought about the problem the way she thought about all problems. Not as a crisis, but as a configuration, a set of elements that needed to be rearranged. "How much is he asking?" she said. Gideon told her. She was quiet for a moment. "We don't have that," she said. "No," he said, "we don't. But the ranch's value is considerably above what it was in October," she said. "The documented water rights, the improved accounts, the supplier contracts. The ranch is a different financial picture than it was." She was already moving through the numbers in her head. "We could approach the bank for a mortgage against the Dune parcel, secured by the improved value of Cross Ridge." He looked at her. "You think a bank would—" "A year ago, no," she said. "Now, with the documentation and the clean accounts and a year of improved financials," she paused. "Possibly. I'd want to talk to the bank manager, not through an intermediary, myself." "You want to go into the bank and negotiate a mortgage?" "Yes," she said. "Is there a reason I shouldn't?" He looked at her for a moment. Then, with a fullness she didn't see often, a full actual smile. Not the almost smile, but the real version, which appeared rarely enough that she paid attention when it came. "No," he said. "No reason at all. LeChuck." The bank manager's name was Arthur Veen, and he was a careful man who wore his skepticism on the outside where you could see it, which Evelyn found preferable to the kind that hid. She came to his office on a Tuesday with the Cross Ridge accounts for the past year, the Crow letter documenting the water rights, and a summary she had prepared herself of the ranch's financial trajectory. What it had been in October, what it was now, and what the Dune parcel would do for the property's total value and the ranch's access security. Veen read through her materials with the focused attention of a man who understood documents and was genuinely engaged by good ones. He asked 4 questions. She answered 3 of them immediately and took notes on the 4th because it required a piece of information she didn't have with her, which she told him plainly. "I can have that number to you by Friday," she said. He looked at the summary again. "You put this together yourself," he said. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Cross is running the ranch," she said. "This is what I do." He looked at her over the top of the documents. It was not a dismissive look. It was the look of a man updating a picture he'd had in his head. "Friday," he said. "Bring the additional figure and we'll talk terms." She brought the figure on Friday. They talked terms for an hour. She came home with a preliminary agreement that was not everything she'd asked for and was better than she'd expected, and she sat down at the kitchen table with Gideon and laid out the terms plainly. "Monthly payments," she said. 12 years. The Dune parcel becomes part of Cross Ridge, and the creek access becomes ours on both sides. Gideon looked at the preliminary agreement. He looked at it for a long time. "Monthly payments," he said. "Which we can make," she said. "I've run the numbers 3 times." "I know you have," he said. He kept looking at the document. 12 years. "We'll pay it off in 9 if the cattle prices hold," she said. He looked up. "You think they'll hold?" "I think they'll fluctuate," she said. "They always do, but the average over the past decade has been stable enough that 9 years is reasonable, not optimistic." He nodded slowly. He turned the document over and looked at the back as if the additional page might tell him something the front hadn't. Then he put it flat on the table and spread his hand across it in a gesture that was more than just examining. It was something like acceptance, the physical act of choosing something. "Sign it," he said. She signed it on Monday and walked out of Veen's office into the September sun and stood on the boardwalk of Black Creek for a moment, on the same street where she'd sat on a bench a year ago with nowhere to go and no one standing for her. The street looked the same. The buildings were the same. The dog by the water trough might have been the same dog. She couldn't tell. Everything looked the same and nothing was. She was not the same woman who had sat on that bench. She was the same person. The same skills, the same direct way of speaking, the same practical approach to problems that people had been underestimating her entire life. But the world around her had changed shape because she had been here long enough and worked hard enough and refused to be small enough that the shape of the world had to accommodate her. That was not a romantic idea. It was just true. The first anniversary of her arrival in Black Creek fell on a Thursday in October, and she didn't mention it to anyone because it wasn't the kind of thing she marked with ceremony. But she was aware of it, in the quiet way you are aware of things that have moved from the category of before into the category of after. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, the last of the squash harvested and stored in the root cellar that she and Tom had cleaned out in September. The Dune parcel was officially part of Cross Ridge, the fences walked and documented, the creek access secured on both sides. The accounts for the year showed a ranch that was, for the first time since Martha died, operating with genuine margin rather than managed deficit. Not richly, not without the careful attention that would always be required, but solidly. With the kind of solidity that meant one bad winter or one sick child or one drop in cattle prices would be a difficulty rather than a catastrophe. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up, with her tea and her ledger, going through the month's figures the way she went through them every first Thursday of the month. The house was quiet around her. Upstairs, she could hear the particular creak of Caleb's bed that meant he was awake but not yet up, and the silence from Clara's room that meant she was still asleep, which was also characteristic. Clara slept deeply and woke sharply, like a person who had learned that the transition between the two was best made quickly. Gideon's side of the bed had been empty when she came down, which meant he was already out with Tom, which was also characteristic. He started before dawn when the season required it, and she had stopped waiting for him to come to breakfast because he never did, and instead left his food covered on the back of the stove where it would stay warm until he came in. She went through the figures with her usual attention, making notes in the margin where things needed following up, and when she finished, she closed the ledger and held her tea with both hands and looked at the kitchen. At the window she'd reglazed in November, at the shelves she'd organized and reorganized as the months changed what was needed on them, at the hook by the door where Caleb's coat hung beside Clara's beside Gideon's, at the scorch mark on the floor beside the stove that had been there when she arrived, and was still there because it was part of the floor. And the floor was part of the house, and the house was part of a life that had been here before her and would go on after. She thought about this woman who had stepped off the train a year ago with her carpet bag and her hat box and a letter from a man she'd never met, and she tried to locate the distance between that woman and this one. It was not as large as people might have expected. She had not become someone different. She was the same person she had always been, practical, direct, capable of sustained effort on things that mattered, constitutionally unable to pretend that things were fine when they were not. The same person Tom Farley had dismissed in 30 seconds, that Harvey Doone had found unpresentable, that Walt Briggs had found too complicated. The thing that had changed was not her. The thing that had changed was the ground under her feet. She had found ground that was worth standing on, and she had worked it and maintained it and defended it when it needed defending, and it had, in return, held her. There was a lesson in that, she thought, not a simple one. Not the kind that fit neatly into a saying. It was the lesson that your worth is not determined in a 30-second assessment by a man who doesn't know you and is not paying attention. Your worth is not determined by who chooses you or who passes you over. Your worth is demonstrated, slowly and imperfectly, through the quality of what you build and the honesty with which you build it, and the refusal to stop when the building is hard. She had not arrived at Cross Ridge and transformed it through some special gift. She had arrived and looked at it clearly and worked with what was there, with what was broken and what was solid, with what could be recovered and what needed to be let go, with a man who was difficult and grieving and capable, with children who were suspicious and resilient and worth the patience they required. She had done the ordinary work of an ordinarily capable person who had finally found somewhere worth doing the work. That was enough. She had found, over this year, that enough was more than she'd been told to expect. Clara came downstairs at 7 and found her at the table and sat down across from her with the morning directness that was Clara's particular quality. No gradual waking, just suddenly fully present, her dark eyes alert and already taking in the world. "The rosemary came back," Clara said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I checked it yesterday." Clara poured herself coffee. She still drank coffee at 8 years old, and Evelyn had given up being concerned about it because Clara was not a person you changed by expressing concern. "I want to plant more of it next year," she said, "along the whole south border." "That's a lot of rosemary," Evelyn said. "I know what I want," Clara said. "You do," Evelyn agreed. Clara drank her coffee and looked at the ledger, closed now on the table between them. "Were the numbers good?" she said. "Better than last month," Evelyn said. Clara nodded, satisfied. She had been tracking the ranch's financial progress in her own way since the winter, not through the ledger, which she'd approached once and found insufficiently dramatic, but through the more immediate evidence of whether there was enough for what the ranch needed. New fence posts when they were needed, a second horse for the spring work, the materials for the dune fence walk. She counted these things with the attention of a child who had understood, earlier than most children understand such things, that the material security of her life was not guaranteed and was worth paying attention to. Caleb came down at 7:30 and ate his breakfast with the systematic focus he brought to food, and then looked at Evelyn across the table with the same direct brown eyes he'd had in the diner on the day she'd agreed to have coffee with his father. "It's been a year," he said. She looked at him. "Has it?" "Since you came," he said. Not asking, stating. He'd clearly been counting. "About that," she said. He considered this. "It's better," he said, with the plain, unembellished certainty of a child making an accurate observation. "Before was not bad, but harder. And now it's better." "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." "Are you going to stay?" he said. She looked at him for a moment, at this boy who had asked her the same question in different forms since the first week, at the diner, in the kitchen while she'd fixed the window, in the barn that first afternoon when he'd handed her tools she didn't need. Always checking, always making sure, because he was old enough to understand that people left and young enough to still need the reassurance. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to stay." He nodded once and finished his breakfast. Gideon came in at noon with the cold of the October morning still on his coat, and she had his food ready on the back of the stove, and he sat down and ate it without ceremony, and she sat across from him with the second cup of tea she'd made herself, and they talked about the north pasture rotation and the state of the new dune fence and a cattle buyer Tom had heard about out of Salina who might be worth contacting in the spring. They talked about these things the way they talked about everything, directly, without unnecessary words, with the specific shorthand of two people who had learned each other's thinking through long proximity. He listened when she said something worth listening to. She listened when he did. They disagreed sometimes with the matter-of-fact friction of two people who both had opinions and didn't treat disagreement as a crisis. They had never been easy together in the way of people for whom things come without effort. They had been honest together, and they had been useful to each other, and they had been present through the hard parts, which was worth more than easy and lasted longer. When he finished, he pushed the plate back and drank his coffee and looked at her across the table. "The dune parcel," he said. "I was thinking we put a small second herd on the north section next spring. Young stock. Let them grow on the creek grass." She thought about it. "We'd need another hired hand for the summer. Tom can't manage both sections in calving season." "I know," he said. "I was thinking about it." "Boyd Holt's son is 16, she said. "Looking for summer work. Ruth mentioned it in August." He almost smiled. "You filed that away." "I file everything away," she said. He looked at her. The October light was coming through the kitchen window, and it was the same window she'd looked through a year ago. The same kitchen table, the same iron stove, and none of it was the same because everything that had happened in it had changed what it contained. He looked at her with the full, settled, unguarded look that she'd come to understand as the version of himself he showed when he'd stopped working to hold something back. "I made a mistake," he said, "in October, last year, on that street." She shook her head slightly. I want to say it once," he said. "That's all. I looked at you on that platform and I decided I knew what I was looking at, and I was wrong. And everything that happened after, and everything this house is now, started because you didn't get back on the train." He paused. "I need to say that once, out loud." She held his gaze. She thought about the bench, about the laughter from the saloon, about the carpet bag and the hat box and the $31 and some cents, and the flat determination to stand up and walk regardless of where she was going. "I almost did," she said. "Get back on the train." "I know," he said. "It would have been the easier thing." "I know," he said again. "I'm glad you didn't." She looked at him, at this difficult, careful, quietly feeling man who had become, through no particular design, the person she came home to. "So am I," she said. Outside, the October plains were the color of old gold, and the sky above them was the deep mineral blue of a season preparing to change. And Cross Ridge Ranch sat on its land with the settled weight of something that had survived what it needed to survive and was still standing. The fence held. The water ran. The accounts balanced. The children were at school and would come home at 4, and Clara would check the rosemary before she came inside, and Caleb would tell them both about something he'd learned that day, with the earnest thoroughness he brought to information. None of it was perfect. The gates still hung slightly wrong in wet weather. The January payments would come again, as they always did. There would be hard winters and difficult seasons and moments when the distance between what was needed and what was available would require the kind of hard, unglamorous work that no one celebrates because everyone is too busy doing it. There would be mornings when the grief that Gideon still carried would be present in the room like weather, and evenings when Clara's defenses went back up without warning, and days when the ranch asked more than any of them had to give. And they gave it anyway because that was what the work required. But there would also be Thursday biscuits with a small pinch of sugar. There would be ledgers that told a story of a family that had learned to hold itself together through honest effort. There would be a kitchen table that was the center of a life being built in real time, imperfectly and without pretense, by people who had chosen each other not out of romance, but out of something steadier and rarer, out of recognition and respect, and the willingness to keep showing up. Evelyn Harper had come to Black Creek with a letter and a carpet bag and $31. And the kind of stubborn, practical, unsentimental hope that doesn't announce itself as hope because it's too busy being something else. She had not been chosen. She had chosen. And that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever mattered. The woman everyone rejected had built a life so solid that their rejection had become, in the long perspective of the year, simply the door she'd had to walk through to get to the work. She picked up the ledger and opened it to November. There was always more work to do.